You know those friends you've known forever? The ones who've been there since grade school, who know all your secrets and dreams. For Sarah Lee Stern, those friends were Liam McAtasney and Preston Taylor. They called themselves the Squad. Just 3 kids from Neptune City, New Jersey, growing up together, sharing everything from photos to YouTube obsessions. But here's the thing about trust. Sometimes it's the perfect weapon. On December 2nd, 2016, something strange happened on the Route 35 Belmar Bridge. A silver Oldsmobile sat abandoned in the darkness, keys still in the ignition, no driver in sight. Pretty odd. Sure, but what made it really weird? The owner, 19-year-old Sarah, had seemingly vanished into thin air. Her dog was home alone, locked in his cage, something anyone who knew Sarah would tell you she'd never do. Her passport was still in her drawer, and get this, $25,000 in cash sat untouched in her bank vault. Speaking of strange, just a week before, on Thanksgiving, Liam had pitched what he called a movie idea to another friend. The plot? A detailed story about murdering a girl and throwing her body off a bridge. Quite the coincidence, right?
You didn't hear about it? It was all over the news.
Right, but I didn't know if you went through.
Yeah. And the worst part is, we threw her off the bridge, and the body never showed up.
It's probably frozen.
It's probably all the way out in the ocean.
And it's fucking frozen, so she's not coming up anytime soon. Her body's probably at the bottom of the fucking ocean, or she got eaten by a shark or some fucking shit.
Yeah.
Bro, this is like a fucking movie, bro.
Yeah.
But the strangest detail of all? When the truth finally came out, investigators discovered something chilling on Liam's phone. A timer. 19 minutes and 4 seconds. That's how long he spent watching his childhood friend take her last breath. Timing it like you might time a microwave dinner. This isn't just another true crime story. This is a story about how the deepest kind of trust can turn into the deadliest kind of betrayal. About how someone's closest friends became their worst nightmare. And about how a young artist who lived by the motto, practice reckless optimism, never saw the darkness hiding behind familiar smiles. Sarah Lee Stern's bright spirit first illuminated Neptune City, New Jersey, when she was born to Michael and Carla Stern in March 1997. As their only child, she grew into a young woman whose talents spanned both athletics and arts. At Neptune High School, she earned spots on the varsity softball and swim teams, but it was her passion for creative expression, drawing, painting, and digital media that truly defined her character. During these high school years, Sarah formed what seemed to be unbreakable bonds with 2 classmates who would become central figures in her story. Liam McAtasney had been her friend since grade school, sharing interests in video games and comic books. When Liam befriended Preston Taylor during freshman year, the 3 became inseparable, calling themselves the Squad. Their friendship appeared so genuine that Preston even took Sarah to junior prom. Life dealt Sarah a devastating blow in 2013 when her mother Carla passed away from cancer. Through this loss, Sarah found comfort in art and the emerging world of online content creation. She became an avid participant in the YouTube community, regularly attending conventions like VidCon and Comic-Con. Her motto, practice reckless optimism, carried her through these difficult times and became her signature approach to life. By 2016, Sarah was studying TV production and art at Brookdale Community College, pursuing her creative dreams with her father's full support. She maintained close ties with Liam and Preston, who lived just blocks away in a house owned by Liam's parents. To everyone who knew her, Sarah appeared to be on the cusp of a bright future, surrounded by trusted friends and armed with her characteristic optimism and creativity. Those who knew Sarah best described her as unapologetically herself, someone whose authentic nature drew others to her naturally. Her high school yearbook quote captured this perfectly. Be yourself from the beginning to the end of time. Don't ever be what you think other people would want you to be. Tragically, it would be her trust in those closest to her that would lead to her undoing, transforming a story of friendship and creativity into one of betrayal and loss. Life can change in an instant, often in ways we never expect. For Sarah Lee Stern, That moment came during a routine visit to her family's second home in Avon by the Sea, New Jersey. While there, she made a discovery that would unknowingly set in motion a chain of events leading to tragedy. A shoebox filled with cash, tucked away and forgotten until that fateful day. The money itself was unusual old bills, their edges brittle and worn with time. The currency showed its age not just in appearance but in condition, with many bills broken and fragile to the touch. This wasn't the kind of money you'd commonly see in circulation. It was the type that might raise eyebrows at a bank or store. The exact amount wasn't immediately clear, but it was substantial enough to make any young person's eyes widen thousands upon thousands of dollars. More money than Sarah had ever seen in one place. As Sarah would soon learn, this wasn't just found money. It was an inheritance, a final gift from her mother who had passed away 3 years earlier. The discovery carried an emotional weight beyond its monetary value. These worn bills represented her mother's careful planning, a way of providing for her daughter even after she was gone. It was a bittersweet revelation, bringing both joy at the unexpected gift and a fresh wave of grief for the mother who had hidden it away. Family members who knew about the money gave Sarah what seemed like sound advice at the time: keep it quiet. Don't tell anyone about it. It was the kind of counsel that comes from wisdom and experience, understanding how money can change people and complicate relationships. They knew that sudden wealth, even modest amounts, can bring out the worst in people, turning friends into opportunists and trust into vulnerability. But Sarah, with the natural trust of youth and faith in her closest friends, found it difficult to keep such a significant secret entirely to herself. She chose to confide in a select few people she believed she could trust completely. Among them was Liam McAtasney, her friend since grade school, someone who had been there through the loss of her mother and countless other life events. In Sarah's mind, sharing this information with Liam was as natural as sharing any other part of her life with a trusted friend. What Sarah didn't know, couldn't have known, was how this information would affect Liam. Behind his familiar face and years of friendship, something dark began to stir. Liam's reaction to the news would later prove chilling in hindsight. He began telling others about Sarah's discovery, but not with the discretion of a trusted confidant. Instead, he spoke about it in ways that should have raised red flags, describing it as the type of money someone would kill for, his exact words, though their sinister implications wouldn't become clear until it was too late. Taking precautions with her newfound wealth, Sarah decided to store the money in a safety deposit box at a local bank. It was a mature decision, showing she understood the need to protect her inheritance despite her openness about its existence with trusted friends. The safety deposit box became both a practical solution and, unknowingly, a key element in the timeline of events that would follow. The money's condition presented its own challenges. The worn, brittle nature of the bills meant they couldn't simply be deposited or spent without raising questions. This wasn't modern currency that could easily blend into everyday transactions. The aged bills required careful handling and consideration for how they might eventually be used. It was a detail that would later become significant in understanding the full scope of what happened to Sarah. As time passed, Sarah continued to visit the bank periodically, managing her inheritance while planning for her future. She had dreams of perhaps using some of the money to help fund her move to Canada, a plan she had been considering for some time. The money represented possibilities for education, for travel, for pursuing her creative dreams. She saw it as a stepping stone toward her goals, never imagining it would instead become a motive for unthinkable betrayal. The discovery of this money created ripples that spread far beyond Sarah's initial circle of trusted confidants. As Liam shared the information with others, the story of Sarah's inheritance began to circulate, though few knew the exact amount or details. Rumors and speculation grew, transforming the reality of worn, old bills into fantasies of easy wealth. While Sarah continued to treat the money with care and consideration, others, particularly Liam, began to view it with dangerous obsession. This hidden inheritance, meant to be a blessing from a mother to her daughter, instead became the catalyst for events that would ultimately lead to Sarah's disappearance. December 2nd, 2016, began like any other winter day in Neptune City, New Jersey. None of Sarah Lee Stern's friends, family, or neighbors could have known that by the end of this day, the 19-year-old would vanish, leaving behind a mystery that would shake their tight-knit community to its core. The morning hours passed routinely enough. It wasn't until around noon that the day's events began to unfold. Liam McAtasney, Sarah's longtime friend, called her to ask if she wanted to get something to eat. This wasn't unusual. Their friendship had always included casual hangouts and spontaneous plans. According to Liam's later account, they met up sometime between 1 o'clock and 2 p.m. Their first stop that afternoon was Taco Bell, a simple lunch between friends. Security footage would later confirm their presence there, with Sarah appearing to be in good spirits. She was smiling, chatting, showing no signs of distress or any indication that this day would be different from any other. After lunch, they had a specific errand to run, one that would later prove crucial to understanding the events that followed. That errand was a visit to the Draper's house, Sarah's neighbors. She had texted them earlier about dropping off a bin containing some of her mother's belongings. The Drapers weren't home at the time, but they had told Sarah it was fine to leave the items. This detail, the bin of her mother's belongings, would later take on new significance as investigators tried to piece together Sarah's state of mind on that final day. The most critical stop of the day was at the bank. Sarah visited her safety deposit box, where she kept the inheritance money she had discovered months earlier. Bank surveillance footage captured her there, waving at the teller, still showing no signs of distress. She withdrew some money that day, though notably left behind $25,000. A detail that would later become significant in understanding what really happened to her. After the bank visit, Sarah and Liam returned to her house. According to Liam's initial statements to police, they spent time playing video games upstairs before he left for work around 4:45 p.m. This timeline seemed ordinary enough, but like many details from that day, it would eventually be revealed as part of a carefully constructed deception. The next concrete evidence of activity came in the early morning hours of December 3rd, at 2:46 a.m., when an Uber driver crossing the Route 35 Belmar Bridge made a troubling discovery. The driver, who wished to remain anonymous, called 911 to report an abandoned vehicle. His call revealed both concern and confusion.
911, where is the emergency?
Not emergency. Actually on the Belmar Bridge, right after heading south in the middle of the bridge, there's a car that's abandoned. It's off to the side of the road, but
The Belmar Bridge being the 35 bridge?
yeah, the 35 bridge would be going from north going south
Into Belmar.
into Belmar. Yeah.
Right. Hey, did you pass the midpoint? Because up to the midpoint is Neptune, and after the midpoint is Belmar.
So yeah, Neptune actually. Technically, it was after. It looked like it was more on the Neptune side.
So what kind of car is it?
Kind of looks like an old beat up, light tan colored like sedan.
And what was your name, sir?
So if it's okay, I'd just rather be anonymous.
And this is your cell number?
Yeah, I'm driving Uber and Lyft tonight, so I just figured I'd give a call. It's kind of hard to see, I think, if you're coming the other way.
And was there anybody inside the vehicle?
I looked, no.
Okay.
Unless they were sleeping. I couldn't see them by their head being up. Nobody looked like they were in it.
All right.
At 2:52 a.m., an officer arrived at the scene to find a silver 1994 Oldsmobile sedan abandoned on the bridge. What immediately caught the officer's attention was that the keys were still in the ignition. There had been no accident, no sign of damage to the vehicle. But something felt wrong. The officer conducted an initial search of the area, looking for any signs this might have been a suicide attempt, but found no body or personal belongings nearby. The vehicle was quickly identified as being registered to Lillian Stern, Sarah's grandmother, though it was known to be the car Sarah regularly drove. This discovery set in motion a series of events that would soon involve multiple law enforcement agencies and the entire community in a desperate search for answers. Sarah's father, Michael, who was in Florida at the time, received the kind of phone call every parent dreads. When officers asked if he knew why Sarah's car might have been abandoned on the bridge, he instantly knew something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation, he began the long drive back to New Jersey, desperately trying to reach his daughter by phone throughout the journey. Back in Neptune City, two officers went to the Stern residence. finding the front door unlocked after repeated knocks went unanswered. Inside, they found an empty house with only one sign of life: Sarah's beloved dog, Buddy, left alone in his cage. For those who knew Sarah, this detail was immediately alarming. She adored her dog and would never have willingly left him confined without care. The final hours of December 2nd and the early morning of December 3rd would be scrutinized countless times in the months to come. Every detail, from the bank visit to the abandoned car, from Sarah's last known movements to the dog left alone, would be examined and re-examined as investigators tried to understand what had happened to the young woman who seemingly vanished into thin air on that cold winter night. The events of December 2nd, pieced together through security footage, witness statements, and later revelations, would tell a story far more sinister than anyone could have imagined on that first night. In this first interview, Liam laid out what seemed to be a plausible timeline of December 2nd. He described getting food with Sarah, helping her drop off belongings at the Draper's house, and spending time at her home before leaving for work around 4:45 p.m. He claimed to have lost his cell phone that day, a detail that would later take on new significance. Throughout the interview, he maintained a concerned demeanor while subtly suggesting that Sarah might have chosen to disappear. The investigation soon brought them to Preston Taylor, Liam's roommate and another close friend of Sarah's. Unlike Liam's seemingly open cooperation, Preston's initial interview was marked by an apparent attempt to distance himself from Sarah. He referred to her as a mutual friend rather than acknowledging their years of close friendship, including their history of attending prom together. This subtle shift in relationship description caught the attention of experienced investigators. As the investigation progressed, officers learned about the money Sarah had discovered months earlier. The surveillance footage from the bank on December 2nd showed Sarah making what would be her final visit to her safety deposit box. The discovery that she had left behind $25,000 raised immediate questions. If she had planned to run away, as Liam suggested, why would she leave such a significant sum behind? This detail didn't align with the theory of a planned disappearance. The neighbor who had last seen Sarah, Mrs. Draper, provided investigators with potentially concerning information about Sarah's mental state. She mentioned that Sarah might have been depressed, a detail that investigators had to consider carefully. However, unlike many similar cases where law enforcement might fixate on a single theory, the investigators here maintained a broader view, refusing to lock themselves into any one explanation for Sarah's disappearance. The search efforts continued to expand, with the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office and New Jersey State Police joining forces with the U.S. Coast Guard and local law enforcement agencies. The scale of the response reflected both the mysterious nature of Sarah's disappearance and the community's determination to find answers. Each day brought new searches, new interviews, and new attempts to piece together what had happened on that December night. Throughout these initial searches, both Liam and Preston participated in the community efforts, even giving interviews to local media about their concern for their friend. They joined search parties, expressed worry about Sarah's whereabouts, and helped rally others to join the search effort. Their participation, which initially appeared to demonstrate friendship and concern, would later be revealed as part of an elaborate deception. On December 6th, Liam agreed to another interview at the police station. During this conversation, he expanded on his earlier statements, adding more details about Sarah's supposed desire to escape to Canada and her allegedly troubled relationship with her father. He continued to build a narrative that painted Sarah as depressed and eager to leave her life behind, while portraying himself as a concerned friend who just wanted to help find her. The initial phase of the investigation revealed the challenges of pursuing a missing person case where the evidence was largely circumstantial. Investigators had to balance multiple theories. Had Sarah taken her own life? Had she chosen to disappear? Or had something more sinister occurred? The discovery of her abandoned car with keys still in the ignition, coupled with her beloved dog left alone, suggested something beyond a simple disappearance, but proving what had actually happened would require more evidence than was initially available. These early days of the investigation laid the groundwork for what would eventually become a much darker revelation. While investigators carefully gathered evidence and conducted interviews, they were unknowingly building a case that would ultimately expose how friendship could be corrupted by greed, and how trust could be weaponized with deadly consequences. 7 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, in January 2017, the investigation took a dramatic turn when Anthony Curry, a former classmate of Sarah's, came forward with information that would crack the case wide open. His revelation would transform what appeared to be a mysterious disappearance into something far more sinister, exposing a calculated plot that had been months in the making. Anthony had become friends with Liam McAtasney during their junior year of high school, bonding over their shared interest in filmmaking. As an aspiring film director, Anthony often worked on various projects, and Liam would sometimes participate in these creative endeavors. But it was a conversation that took place on Thanksgiving Day 2016, just a week before Sarah's disappearance, that would later prove crucial to solving the case. On that Thanksgiving Day, Liam approached Anthony with what he called an idea for a movie plot. The premise he described was chilling. A story about killing a girl by strangling her and then throwing her body off a bridge with the help of a friend. Anthony's reaction at the time was one of discomfort and confusion. He had no interest in pursuing such a dark and disturbing concept, and the conversation left him feeling uneasy. However, in the immediate aftermath, he dismissed it as perhaps nothing more than Liam's twisted imagination. It wasn't until news of Sarah's disappearance began to spread that the significance of that Thanksgiving conversation started to dawn on Anthony. The connection between Liam's movie plot and the real-life disappearance of Sarah took several weeks to fully register in his mind. When it finally clicked, he realized the horrifying possibility that what Liam had presented as a fictional story might have been something far more sinister, a preview of his actual intentions. Adding to Anthony's growing concerns, Liam had begun sending him messages on Snapchat, casually asking if the police had contacted him yet. These messages carried an undertone of anxiety, suggesting Liam was worried about what Anthony might tell authorities. The combination of the Thanksgiving conversation and these subsequent messages convinced Anthony that he needed to come forward with what he knew. Demonstrating remarkable presence of mind, Anthony understood the ephemeral nature of Snapchat messages and their tendency to disappear after viewing. Rather than taking screenshots, which would have alerted Liam through Snapchat's notification system, Anthony cleverly used a separate digital camera to photograph his phone screen, preserving evidence of their exchanges without tipping off Liam. When Anthony brought this information to investigators, they recognized its potential significance immediately. His testimony about the Thanksgiving conversation and the subsequent messages provided a critical breakthrough in the case. But rather than moving immediately to arrest Liam, investigators saw an opportunity to gather more concrete evidence through a carefully planned sting operation. On January 31, 2017, Anthony agreed to participate in this operation, showing remarkable courage in confronting someone he now suspected of murder. The plan was carefully crafted. Anthony would reach out to Liam with a story about breaking his camera on a film set, supposedly dropping it in a bucket of fake blood. He would ask Liam for money to help replace it, setting up a reason for them to meet in person. The sting operation was fraught with risk. Anthony would be wearing a wire while meeting with someone who, if guilty, had already demonstrated a capacity for violence. The investigating detectives later admitted their concern for Anthony's safety during the operation, knowing they needed to stay close enough to intervene if necessary, while remaining far enough away to avoid detection. When Liam agreed to meet, what followed was one of the most chilling conversations ever recorded in a murder investigation. Upon meeting, Liam's first action was to pat Anthony down for a wire, a moment of intense anxiety for both Anthony and the nearby investigators. After satisfying himself that Anthony wasn't wearing a wire, though he had failed to find it, Liam began to talk. What emerged from that recorded conversation was a confession that shocked even hardened investigators.
You didn't hear about it? It was all over the news.
Right, but I didn't know if you went through.
Yeah. And the worst part is, we threw her off the bridge, and the body never showed up.
It's probably frozen.
It's probably all the way out in the ocean.
And it's fucking frozen, so she's not coming up anytime soon. Her body's probably at the bottom of the fucking ocean, or she got eaten by a shark or some fucking shit.
Yeah.
Bro, this is like a fucking movie, bro.
Yeah. And, dude. Alright, so, I'm hanging out with her. She has, we went to the bank, she took some money out, not all of her money. We're counting it out, and then she goes to walk out the front door. I choke her out, drag her. My biggest problem was the dog, and her dog laid there and watched as I killed her. Didn't do anything. Her fucking dog. What kind of dog? Yeah, what kind of dog is that? It's like some...
Was it a big dog?
It looks like a beagle, but it's like the size of a Great Dane.
Jeez. Nobody was there? Grandmother was
No,
there?
nobody was there. Even her dad wasn't there. He was in Florida.
Yeah, you said that. He was
Liam described, with disturbing casualness, how he had planned Sarah's murder for 6 months. He spoke about timing her death with his phone, about watching her dog's reaction as he strangled her, and about enlisting Preston's help to dispose of her body. The level of detail and the emotionless way he recounted these events revealed a coldness that was almost beyond comprehension. Perhaps most disturbing was Liam's discussion of the money. His disappointment at finding only $10,000 instead of the larger sum he had expected, and his frustration that the old bills might be too suspicious to use. He showed no remorse, no guilt, only annoyance at the practical inconveniences he had encountered in committing murder. "I don't feel any different," he told Anthony. "I don't think about it." This recorded confession provided investigators with exactly what they needed. Not just proof of Liam's guilt, but also evidence of premeditation and the involvement of Preston Taylor. The breakthrough that began with Anthony's memory of a disturbing Thanksgiving conversation had led to the unraveling of the entire murderous plot, revealing how a supposed friendship had been corrupted by greed into something unimaginably dark. Anthony's courage in coming forward and participating in the sting operation, despite the personal risk involved, proved to be the key that unlocked the entire case. His actions would ultimately bring justice for Sarah and provide her family with the answers they so desperately sought, though the truth would prove far more horrifying than anyone had initially imagined. On February 1st, 2017, the day after Liam McAtasney's recorded confession, investigators made their first arrest, but not of Liam. In a strategic decision, they moved to arrest Preston Taylor first, understanding that the pressure of arrest might compel him to cooperate. This tactical choice would prove crucial to building their case, as Preston's reaction exceeded even their expectations. Preston's facade of loyalty to Liam crumbled almost immediately upon his arrest. The young man who had once been part of the squad with Sarah, who had taken her to junior prom, began to reveal the full scope of their horrific plot. His confession painted a picture of premeditation that stretched back months before Sarah's murder, though he claimed the original plan had been merely to rob her of the inherited money. According to Preston's confession, he had known about Liam's intentions for months. The evolution from robbery to murder had been Liam's decision, though Preston did nothing to prevent it. The plan had become increasingly detailed, with the two even considering various methods of killing Sarah before settling on strangulation, believing it would leave the least evidence. They had calculated that making it appear as a suicide would be their best cover. The details Preston provided were precise and damning. He described receiving a Snapchat message from Liam on December 2nd, indicating that he and Sarah were heading to the bank. Preston understood this as the signal that their plan was being put into motion. After Liam murdered Sarah and left for work, Preston's role began. He went to Sarah's house, moved her body from the bathroom to the backyard, concealing it next to a bush under leaves, while he searched unsuccessfully for Liam's lost phone. Preston's confession continued with the events that followed Liam's return from work. Together, they moved Sarah's body from the backyard into the passenger seat of her own car. During this time, they also stole the safe from her house, placing it in Preston's vehicle. The attention to detail in their plan extended to the security camera across the street from Sarah's house. Liam had studied how Sarah typically backed out of her driveway and mimicked her movements precisely to avoid suspicion. Perhaps most crucial to the investigation, Preston revealed the locations where they had hidden the money. They had buried Sarah's safe in Shark River Park, but had moved the approximately $10,000 in cash to a different safe, which they buried near the lighthouse at Sandy Hook. This information would prove invaluable to investigators in recovering physical evidence. Preston's cooperation didn't stop with his confession. He agreed to participate in a detailed reenactment of their actions, returning to Sarah's house with investigators to demonstrate exactly how they had moved her body. The clinical way he described their actions showing no emotion as he detailed their movements, was deeply disturbing to the experienced investigators present. He also took them to the Belmar Bridge, explaining how they had worked together to lift Sarah's body over the railing. Armed with Preston's confession and the evidence he provided, investigators moved to arrest Liam McAtasney. The physical evidence they discovered corroborated Preston's account in crucial ways. When they recovered the buried lockbox containing Sarah's money, they found it was a Century safe box with the number 002. In a damning piece of evidence, when Liam was arrested, they found on his keychain a key for a Century safe lockbox, also numbered 002. The investigation also uncovered digital evidence that supported their case. While security cameras on the bridge itself weren't functioning, a frustratingly common occurrence in such cases, a camera on Sarah's neighbor's house provided crucial corroboration of Preston's timeline. Though the footage was dark, it captured headlights approaching Sarah's house from the back and a figure moving toward the rear of the home at the times Preston had described. Liam's arrest marked the end of his facade as a concerned friend. Unlike his previous willingness to speak with investigators, he immediately lawyered up, refusing to answer any questions. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The recorded confession to Anthony Curry, Preston's detailed testimony, the physical evidence of the safe key, and the supporting security footage all combined to create a compelling case. The arrests brought to light the full scope of the betrayal Sarah had suffered. Two young men she had trusted, one a childhood friend and the other a former prom date, had plotted her death for months. They had participated in searches for her, given interviews expressing concern for her welfare, and played the role of grieving friends while knowing exactly what had happened to her. The calculated nature of their actions, from the initial planning to the attempt to make her death appear as a suicide, revealed a level of premeditation that shocked the community. As news of the arrest spread, the community that had spent weeks searching for Sarah had to grapple with the horrifying truth. The very people who had walked alongside them in searches, who had appeared on local media pleading for information about Sarah's whereabouts, had been responsible for her death all along. The betrayal extended beyond Sarah to encompass the entire community that had invested their hearts and efforts in finding her. The trial of Liam McAtasney began on January 23, 2019, in a courtroom thick with tension and anticipation. For Sarah's father, Michael, and the entire community that had been shaken by her murder, this represented the final step in their long journey toward justice. What unfolded in that courtroom would reveal not only the full scope of the crime, but also one of the most bizarre defense strategies ever presented in a murder case. The defense team's primary strategy was so extraordinary it bordered on the absurd. They claimed that Liam's recorded confession to Anthony Curry was not actually a confession at all, but rather an audition tape for a movie. This assertion, that the detailed and chilling description of Sarah's murder was merely a performance, strained credibility to its breaking point. The idea that someone would describe killing their friend, complete with precise details about timing her death and watching her dog's reaction, as part of an acting exercise seemed beyond comprehension. Without Sarah's body ever being recovered, the defense attempted to exploit this absence of physical evidence. They suggested that Preston Taylor, who had already admitted his role in the crime, could have been the actual killer since Liam was at work during part of the evening in question. This strategy ignored the overwhelming evidence of Liam's recorded confession and the numerous details that only the killer could have known. The defense's final attempt to create reasonable doubt came through a witness named Craig Hetzel, who testified that he had seen Sarah walking alone down the street around 5 a.m. on December 3rd. However, this testimony quickly unraveled under scrutiny. Hetzel claimed to have seen Sarah's abandoned car on the Belmar Bridge at the same time, yet records clearly showed the car had been towed hours earlier. Despite these inconsistencies, Hetzel remained adamant about his sighting, even suggesting that Sarah might still be alive somewhere. The prosecution's case, in contrast, was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence that showed Liam had deliberately and carefully planned Sarah's murder for months, with the sole purpose of stealing what he believed would be between $50,000 and $100,000. They detailed how he had manipulated investigators by feeding them false information about Sarah's mental health and her relationship with her father, all while participating in searches for her body. Preston Taylor's testimony proved crucial to the prosecution's case. Now cooperating fully as part of his plea deal, Preston took the stand and walked the jury through the explicit details of their plan. He described their months of plotting, including conducting a dry run to determine how long the entire process would take. His testimony revealed how they had used Sarah's known desire to move to Canada as part of their plot, convincing her to withdraw money from the bank under the guise of planning her trip. The most powerful moment of the trial came when the prosecution played the recording of Liam's confession to Anthony Curry. Michael Stern, forced to listen to the detailed description of his daughter's murder, broke down in the courtroom. The recording revealed not just the facts of the crime but the chilling casualness with which Liam discussed ending Sarah's life. His complaints about getting less money than expected and his statement that he felt no different after the murder provided a window into a mind seemingly devoid of empathy or remorse. The prosecution also presented evidence that directly linked Liam to Sarah's stolen money. The Century Safebox key found on his keychain matched perfectly with the recovered lockbox containing the stolen cash, providing a physical connection between Liam and the proceeds of his crime. This evidence helped establish not just his guilt but also his motive. Expert testimony played a crucial role in explaining why Sarah's body had never been found. An ocean engineering expert testified about the tide and current conditions on the night of December 2nd, explaining that within 24 hours of entering the water, a body would likely have been pulled 7 miles offshore. This testimony helped the jury understand why the absence of Sarah's body did not diminish the strength of the case against Liam. Michael Stern's testimony proved particularly moving as he spoke about his relationship with his daughter, definitively countering the false narrative Liam had created about their supposedly troubled relationship. Michael described their last text exchange, where Sarah had commented on how pretty Disney World's castle looked with its lights, hardly the communication of someone desperate to escape her father, as Liam had claimed. The trial also revealed the full extent of how Liam and Preston had manipulated the community's trust. They had not only participated in searches but had given interviews to local media, expressing concern for Sarah while knowing exactly what had happened to her. This betrayal extended beyond Sarah to encompass the entire community that had invested time and emotional energy in searching for her. Throughout the trial, Liam maintained the same emotionless demeanor he had shown in his recorded confession. He showed no reaction to the devastating testimony against him, no remorse as Sarah's father broke down in tears, no sign that he recognized the gravity of what he had done. This cold demeanor seemed to confirm the portrait painted by his recorded confession of someone who could commit murder and feel no different. The prosecution's case painted a clear picture of a calculated murder motivated by simple greed. They showed how Liam had weaponized his lengthy friendship with Sarah, using her trust to execute a plan he had developed over months. The evidence demonstrated not just that Liam had killed Sarah, but that he had done so with a level of premeditation and calculation that spoke to the darkness of his character. On February 26, 2019, after weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury reached their verdict. Liam McAtasney was found guilty on all charges, including murder, felony murder, robbery, desecration of human remains, conspiracy to desecrate human remains, tampering with evidence, and hindering apprehension. 4 months later, he received his sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the other charges. Preston Taylor, who had taken a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against Liam, received a sentence of 18 years in prison plus a $10,000 fine. His cooperation with investigators, while crucial to securing justice for Sarah, did not erase his role in her death. He will be eligible for parole in May of 2032, though no amount of time served can truly compensate for his part in betraying and disposing of his friend's body. For Michael Stern, the verdicts and sentences brought a complex mix of emotions. While satisfied that justice had been served, he openly expressed his wish that New Jersey still had the death penalty, which had been abolished in 2007. As he poignantly stated, no verdict could bring his daughter back, and no sentence could fully heal the wound left by her loss. The pain of knowing how she died, at the hands of someone she had trusted since childhood, continues to haunt him. In a move that demonstrated their continued lack of remorse, both Liam and Preston attempted to appeal their convictions. These appeals were denied, affirming the justice of their original sentences. Even after conviction, Liam's mother continued to proclaim her son's innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, including his own recorded confession. Her tears during interviews seemed to lack the substance of true grief, especially when compared to the profound sorrow of Sarah's family and true friends. While Sarah's body has never been recovered, the community has found ways to honor her memory. A section of the Belmar Bridge, where she took her final journey, has been decorated as a memorial to her life. In July 2017, over 1,000 people gathered at the local community center for a celebration of Sarah's life. The event focused not on the tragedy of her death, but on the joy and creativity she brought to her 19 years of life. During the celebration, teachers, friends, and community members shared stories about Sarah, painting a picture of a young woman who was, in their words, unapologetically herself. They spoke of her artistic talents, her kindness, her quirky sense of humor, and her ability to make others feel accepted and valued. The phrased practice reckless optimism, which Sarah had loved so much in life, took on new meaning as her community chose to celebrate her spirit rather than dwell on the darkness of her death. Did society fail Augustina Fernandez twice? First by not seeing the warning signs, and then by taking 6 months to uncover the truth that was hiding in plain sight? No is no. These were the powerful last words Augustina's mother delivered to Pablo Parra in court. But why did this 19-year-old medical student have to pay with her life to deliver this message? In a case that shook Argentina to its core, the murder of Augustina exposed a disturbing pattern that began with seemingly innocent gestures: a spare key, a washing machine, friendly dinners, and ended in a carefully orchestrated killing that its perpetrator tried to disguise as a random robbery. But what makes this case particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of the crime. It's how the murderer continued his normal life afterward, attending electronic music festivals and giving media interviews while Augustina's family searched for justice. The discovery of a small piece of blue cloth caught on a fence would eventually unravel an elaborate web of lies, but it raises a haunting question. How many other Augustinas are out there right now, trying to navigate the dangerous waters between politeness and self-preservation? This isn't just a story about a murder. It's a mirror held up to society's face, forcing us to confront the deadly price women sometimes pay for simply saying no. In the sun-drenched city of Santa Rosa, La Pampa, a young woman's dream was taking flight. It was early 2022, and 19-year-old Augustina Fernandez stood at the threshold of everything she had ever wanted. With her warm smile and determined spirit, she had already mapped out the path to her future. She would become a cardiologist, saving lives one heartbeat at a time. Those who knew Augustina remember a girl who carried sunshine in her wake. Her former teacher, Juan, recalls a student whose passion for medicine lit up every classroom she entered. She wasn't just bright, he says, his voice soft with memory. She had this creative spark, this incredible drive to understand everything about the human body. When she talked about becoming a doctor, her eyes would light up with such purpose. In the Fernandez household, Augustina was more than just the eldest daughter. She was a beacon of possibility. Her mother Silvana and father Mariano had always encouraged their children to chase their dreams, no matter how far they might lead. For Augustina, that dream would take her 600 kilometers away to Cipolletti, Rio Negro, where the National University of Comahue held the key to her future in medicine. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Like many students of her generation, Augustina had spent her first year of university learning through a computer screen, navigating the challenges of virtual education during the pandemic. But 2022 brought new hope. Classes would finally be in person, and Augustina could immerse herself in the full university experience she had longed for. She was nervous about moving away, Silvana remembers, her eyes misting as she speaks of those last days at home. But she was so excited too. She had her little sister helping her pack, making lists of everything she'd need for her new life. The bond between the sisters was unbreakable, filled with shared secrets and dreams whispered late into the night. In March 2022, the Fernandez family made the long drive to Cipolletti, their car packed with boxes full of Augustina's belongings and hopes. They had found her a small apartment in a quiet complex on Confluentia Street. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and safe, or so they thought. It would be close enough to the university for easy commuting. A perfect starter home for a young student beginning her independent life. Augustina took to her new surroundings with characteristic enthusiasm. She decorated her small space with photos of her family, medical textbooks lined up neatly on makeshift shelves. Her mother helped her arrange everything just so, both of them imagining the countless hours of study that would take place at the small desk by the window. She was so grateful, Silvana recalls, her voice catching. She kept thanking us for supporting her, for helping her make this happen. She promised she would make us proud. A promise Augustina had already fulfilled simply by being who she was, a dedicated student, a loving daughter, a caring sister, and a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. The first few weeks in Cipolletti were filled with the typical adjustments of any university student living alone for the first time. Augustina learned to budget her money, cook simple meals, and navigate the rhythm of her new city. She made friends quickly, her natural warmth drawing people to her. She would video call her family regularly, sharing stories about her classes, her new friends, and her growing excitement about her future in medicine. None of them could have known that this bright beginning would lead to such darkness, that the same apartment complex that represented Augustina's independence would become the scene of unimaginable tragedy. That among the new faces she encountered in those early days was one that would ultimately bring an end to all her dreams. In just 3 short months, the story of Augustina Fernandez would transform from a tale of youthful ambition and promise into one of Argentina's most haunting cases of femicide. But to understand how such promise could be so brutally extinguished, we must first look at the seemingly innocent beginnings of a chance encounter that would set in motion a chain of events leading to that fatal July night. The future that stretched before Augustina in those early spring days seemed limitless. She was 19, beautiful, intelligent, and determined. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a dreamer. She was everything a young woman should be allowed to be, and she had no way of knowing that her time was running out. The first time Augustina Fernandez saw Pablo Parra, he was washing his car in the apartment complex's parking lot. It was a seemingly mundane moment on a March afternoon in 2022, as the 37-year-old oil company technician methodically cleaned his vehicle while Augustina and her parents toured what would become her new home. He appeared friendly enough, offering a neighborly wave as the family passed by, a gesture that would later take on a much darker significance. He seemed nice, Silvana Capello, Augustina's mother, would later recall, her voice tight with regret. Just a normal neighbor going about his day. How could we have known? That first encounter, so casual and unremarkable, would prove to be the beginning of an obsession that would end in tragedy. Pablo Parra cut an unassuming figure in the community. A technical safety specialist at a local oil and gas company, he lived alone in the ground floor apartment of the complex. To his colleagues, he was professional and competent, someone who understood emergency protocols and safety procedures. To his neighbors, he was polite but kept mostly to himself. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lay something far more sinister. The 18-year age gap between Parra and Augustina should have been the first red flag. Even before she officially moved in, he had already begun inserting himself into her life. When he learned she would be relocating from Santa Rosa, he offered to pick her up from the airport, a gesture that made Silvana uncomfortable enough to insist her daughter decline. What kind of grown man offers to pick up a teenage girl he's never met? Silvana would later ask investigators, the pain evident in her voice. Now I know it was the first sign of his fixation on her. Once Augustina moved in, Parra's presence in her life grew steadily more pronounced. He positioned himself as the helpful neighbor, always available to assist the young student still finding her footing in a new city. He offered the use of his washing machine when Augustina didn't have one of her own. He gave her a copy of his apartment key, ostensibly to make it easier for her to do laundry. Each gesture, seemingly kind on the surface, was another thread in the web he was carefully weaving. To the other residents of the complex, Parra's behavior began to take on an unsettling pattern. Diana Morales, a neighbor who lived across the hall, remembered an interaction that would later haunt her. He was talking about Augustina one day, she testified, and he said, "Did you see that little treat I'm eating?" The way he said it, it made my skin crawl. He spoke about her like she was a thing, not a person. What the neighbors couldn't see were the mounting signs of Para's growing obsession. Despite their casual relationship, he had already begun planning a future that existed only in his mind. He purchased an engagement ring. He made reservations for trips to San Martin de los Andes. He was crafting an entire life story with a young woman who had never agreed to be part of it. Former partners of Para would later come forward with disturbing accounts of his controlling behavior. One ex-girlfriend described how he would monitor her social media, show up uninvited at her workplace, and send messages under false identities to test her loyalty. These patterns of obsessive behavior had been present long before Augustina entered his life. But now they had found a new focus in a 19-year-old student who was just beginning to spread her wings. The most chilling aspect of Para's fixation was how he used his position as a neighbor to maintain constant surveillance of Augustina's life. From his ground floor apartment, he could monitor her comings and goings. He knew when she had visitors, when she was alone, when she was vulnerable. His apartment became an observation post from which he could track every detail of her daily routine. As winter approached in Cipolletti, the temperature wasn't the only thing growing colder. Para's obsession was intensifying, feeding on every small interaction, every casual encounter. When Augustina began to distance herself, showing interest in others her own age, the rejection only fueled his fixation. The helpful neighbor was transforming into something far more dangerous, and time was running out for someone to notice. Looking back now, one resident of the complex would later say, "We all saw pieces of the puzzle, but nobody put them together until it was too late." The friendly neighbor who had once seemed so harmless was revealing himself to be something else entirely. A predator hiding in plain sight, waiting for his moment to strike. In the coming months, the true nature of Pablo Para would be revealed in the most tragic way possible. But in those early days of autumn 2022, he was still just the neighbor next door, a man whose ordinary appearance masked extraordinary dangers, whose seemingly helpful gestures concealed sinister intentions, and whose obsession would ultimately lead to an act of violence that would shock an entire nation. The relationship between Augustina Fernandez and Pablo Para began like many modern connections, casual, undefined, and seemingly uncomplicated. But beneath the surface, a deadly pattern was emerging, one that would reveal the darkest aspects of obsession and control. By April 2022, Augustina had settled into her new life in Cipolletti. Like many 19-year-olds living away from home for the first time, she was exploring her independence, making new friends, and navigating the complexities of adult relationships. What started as neighborly interactions with Para gradually evolved into something more intimate, though for Augustina, it was never meant to be serious. She was very clear about what she wanted, explains Julian, one of Augustina's closest friends at university. She would talk about her neighbor. She never used his name, always just called him the neighbor. And she would tell me how he was becoming too intense, too demanding. Julian's testimony would later become crucial in understanding the progression of events that led to tragedy. The first signs of Para's possessiveness emerged subtly. He began appearing whenever Augustina had visitors, finding reasons to be in the hallway or the courtyard. He would send messages throughout the day, expecting immediate responses. What might have seemed like attention and care to some was, in reality, the beginning of surveillance. Then came the gifts. Not small tokens, but grand gestures that spoke of future plans Augustina had never agreed to. The engagement ring appeared one day, presented without warning or consent. She was shocked, recalls another friend who wishes to remain anonymous. Who gives an engagement ring to someone they're not even dating? She was only 19, still figuring out who she was. And here was this man twice her age planning their future without her permission. The trip to San Martin de los Andes was perhaps the most alarming gesture. Para had planned it all: accommodations, activities, their life together, without consulting Augustina. When she declined, expressing her discomfort with the situation, his behavior began to shift. The rejected gifts became weapons, emotional leverage he would try to use to guilt her into spending more time with him. By June, Augustina was actively trying to distance herself from Para. She had met other people, including Nathaniel, a young man her age who worked at a local bar. Their connection was natural, uncomplicated, everything her interaction with Para was not. But creating this distance proved more difficult than she anticipated. The apartment complex became like a cage, explains Diana Morales, another neighbor. He was always there, watching. If Augustina had friends over, he would find reasons to knock on her door. If she came home late, he would be in the courtyard, pretending to smoke or check his car. It was suffocating. Text messages recovered from Augustina's phone reveal her growing discomfort. In messages to friends, she expressed anxiety about Para's behavior. "He's always there," one message read. "I can't even go to the laundry room without him appearing. I don't know how to make him understand that I don't want what he wants." The pattern was familiar to those who study cases of femicide. Dr. Elena Ramirez, a specialist in gender violence, explains, "What we see here is a classic escalation. The perpetrator begins with what appears to be kindness and attention, then progresses to gifts that create a sense of obligation. When these tactics fail to secure the desired control, the behavior often turns to intimidation and, ultimately, violence." Para's ex-partner would later testify about similar patterns in their relationship. "He would create these elaborate fantasies about our future together," she stated. "When reality didn't match his expectations, he became different, darker. He couldn't accept that my choices might not align with his plans." As June turned to July, the situation was reaching a breaking point. Augustina had begun to confide in her mother about her concerns, though she downplayed the severity of the situation. "She didn't want us to worry," Silvana would later recall, her voice breaking. "She thought she could handle it. She was always so strong, so independent. How could she know that her strength would make him more determined?" The dynamic between them had become a powder keg. Para's obsession had grown alongside Augustina's increasing attempts to establish boundaries. Every time she pulled away, his grip tightened. Every assertion of her independence was met with escalating attempts to control her movements, her relationships, her life. In the first days of July 2022, Augustina was making plans for her future, plans that didn't include Pablo Para. She was excelling in her studies, forming new relationships, living the life of a normal 19-year-old university student. But in the ground floor apartment below her, a man's obsession was reaching its deadly climax, and time was running out. The pattern that had been building for months was about to reach its tragic conclusion. All the warning signs were there: the possessiveness, the surveillance, the inability to accept rejection. But like so many cases before it, these red flags would only become clearly visible in the harsh light of hindsight, after it was too late to save a young woman whose only crime was daring to live life on her own terms. July 2nd dawned like any other winter Saturday in Cipolletti. The morning air was crisp, and the sun cast long shadows across the apartment complex on Confluencia Street. For Augustina Fernandez, it would be a day like many others, until it wasn't. No one could have known that by nightfall, the events of this day would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. The day began normally enough. Augustina had made plans to meet Nathaniel, the young bartender she'd been seeing. Around 3 p.m., he arrived at her apartment. Their relationship was everything her interaction with Pablo Para wasn't: natural, uncomplicated, filled with the kind of easy affection that comes with being young and finding someone who shares your wavelength. "We just wanted to spend time together," Nathaniel would later testify, his voice heavy with emotion. "We played music, talked about everything and nothing. It was just a normal afternoon." The couple shared mate, an herbal drink common in Argentina, and enjoyed each other's company. The window was open, letting in the winter breeze, a detail that would later prove significant. From his ground floor apartment, Pablo Para could hear everything: the laughter, the music, the intimate sounds of a young couple enjoying each other's company. Each sound was like a dagger, feeding his growing rage. During this time, he sent Augustina a message that would go unanswered, a digital timestamp marking the beginning of the end. Around 6 p.m., Nathaniel had to leave for his shift at the bar. She asked me to stay the night after my shift. He would later recall, tears in his eyes. I promised I'd come back around 3 or 4 in the morning. If only I had stayed. If only I had known. His voice trails off, carrying the weight of what-ifs that would haunt him forever. Soon after Nathaniel's departure, Para put his plan into motion. He invited Augustina to have dinner at his apartment. It seemed innocent enough. They were neighbors, after all, and had shared meals before. Augustina accepted, perhaps hoping to maintain a cordial relationship with her neighbor, perhaps not wanting to escalate tensions by refusing. He told her he needed to run some errands first. Prosecutor Martin Pezzetta would later explain. He said he needed to buy some things for dinner. It was all part of his calculated plan. At approximately 7:30 p.m., security cameras captured Para leaving the apartment complex. He made sure he was seen, carefully constructing his alibi. He visited his father's house, bought ice cream, purchased beer, normal activities that would later be used to support his story. But what the cameras didn't capture was his return, not through the front entrance, but through a more sinister route. Investigators would later reconstruct these crucial moments. While Augustina waited in his apartment, Para circled back, using a ladder to scale the back wall of the complex. He navigated through the barbed wire fence, leaving behind a crucial piece of evidence, a scrap of blue fabric with his DNA. This was no crime of passion. It was premeditated, calculated, deadly. 2 neighbors, Diana Morales and Ricardo Espinoza, would later testify about what they heard around this time. There were screams, Diana recalled, her voice shaking, a woman's voice shouting, "Stop! Stop!" Then silence. The kind of silence that makes your blood run cold. The timeline constructed by investigators reveals the horrifying precision of Para's actions. He had created the perfect trap, luring Augustina to his apartment under the guise of friendship, ensuring witnesses saw him leave, then returning secretly to carry out his brutal attack. It was a plan born of obsession, rejection, and a deadly sense of entitlement. By the time Para officially returned to his apartment, ice cream and beer in hand, Augustina lay brutally beaten on his floor. He then initiated the next phase of his plan, staging a robbery and playing the role of the concerned neighbor who had discovered the crime. At 8:45 p.m., Silvana Capello received the call that would shatter her world. It was Para using a neighbor's phone, his voice carefully controlled as he explained that there had been a robbery, that Augustina was hurt, that he had just found her like this when he returned home. The sun had set on Cipolletti, but the darkness that had descended on Confluentia Street would prove far deeper than the night itself. July 2nd, 2022, had begun as an ordinary Saturday. It ended as the day that would forever be marked as the beginning of a nightmare, a day when young love and obsession collided with devastating consequences. A day when dreams were shattered by the sound of screams that no one could unhear. In the annals of criminal investigation, it's often said that there's no such thing as a perfect crime. But Pablo Para had spent weeks, perhaps months, crafting what he believed was an unassailable plan. The prosecution would later reveal how each element was meticulously orchestrated, showing the chilling calculation behind what was initially portrayed as a robbery gone wrong. The attack itself was brutal in its execution. After secretly re-entering his apartment through the back entrance, Para confronted Augustina. The forensic evidence would later tell the story that Para tried so hard to hide. Dr. Maria Santos, the lead forensic investigator, explains, the first blow caught her by surprise. When she tried to escape, he slammed the door on her hand, breaking multiple fingers. This wasn't random violence. It was methodical, controlled. As Augustina fought for her life, her attempts to defend herself left crucial evidence under her fingernails. DNA that would later become a point of contention in the investigation. The attack continued with increasing violence, focused primarily on her head. The pattern of injuries, Dr. Santos continues, suggests someone who wanted to silence her, to stop her from crying out, from being heard. After the attack, Para's movements were precise and practiced. He changed his clothes, carefully concealing the ones he had worn during the assault. He scattered items around his apartment, creating the appearance of a rushed robbery. Then came the most calculated part of his plan, establishing his alibi. He didn't just create an alibi, explains Detective Roberto Vega. He created a performance. Security cameras captured Parra at various locations. His father's house, an ice cream shop, a local store buying beer. Each stop was deliberately chosen, each transaction carefully timed. He made sure to use his debit card, leaving an electronic trail of his movements. The staging of the crime scene was equally meticulous. Parra removed certain items, Augustina's phone, a bag of clothes, his own cell phone, while leaving others of greater value untouched. 2 brand new phones and a wallet containing money were left in plain sight, Detective Vega notes. What kind of thief takes clothes but leaves cash? When Parra finally discovered Augustina, his response was carefully calibrated. He went to a neighbor's apartment, borrowed their phone, and made 3 calls to emergency services, to the police, and to Augustina's mother. Each call painted him as the concerned neighbor, the innocent bystander who had stumbled upon a tragedy. His demeanor during the calls was telling, says emergency operator Elena Ruiz, who took the first call. Most people who discover a violent crime scene are panicked, emotional. He was composed, almost methodical in his description of events. What Parra couldn't have planned for were the small details that would later unravel his carefully constructed narrative. The piece of blue fabric caught on the barbed wire, bearing his DNA. The testimonies of neighbors who heard screams precisely when he claimed to be away. The surveillance footage that showed inconsistencies in his timeline. Perhaps most damning was his behavior in the immediate aftermath. Rocio, his former safety instructor, would later testify that Parra had extensive training in emergency response. He knew CPR, he knew basic first aid, she stated. Yet when he found Augustina, he did nothing to help her. He didn't even check her vital signs. Instead of attempting to save her life, Parra focused on establishing his narrative. He repeated his story of the robbery to anyone who would listen, never varying in the details, as if reciting from a script. While Augustina lay fighting for her life, he was already building his defense. In the hours that followed, while Augustina was rushed to the hospital, Parra continued his performance. He appeared at the hospital with his parents, offering support to Augustina's family even as he knew he was responsible for their pain. It was beyond calculated, says prosecutor Martín Petzetta. It was cruel. The plan might have worked if not for one crucial miscalculation. Parra underestimated the determination of investigators, the observant nature of his neighbors, and most importantly, the fierce love of a mother who would not rest until she uncovered the truth about what happened to her daughter. As Augustina lay in the hospital, her life slipping away, the perfect plan began to show its first cracks. The staged robbery scene, the calculated alibi, the careful performance, all would eventually crumble under the weight of evidence and truth. But for 3 agonizing days, while Augustina fought for her life, Pablo Parra walked free, believing he had executed the perfect crime. The reality would prove different. As investigators would discover, there is no such thing as a perfect plan when it comes to murder. Every action leaves a trace, every calculation leaves a clue, and every attempt to cover up the truth only leads to more questions. In the end, Parra's meticulous planning would become the very evidence that would condemn him. The moment Silvana Capello received that phone call at 8:45 p.m. on July 2nd, something deep within her knew this was no ordinary robbery. The controlled voice of Pablo Parra on the other end of the line, explaining how he had discovered her daughter, sent chills down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter night. His voice was too calm, Silvana would later testify, her hands clasped tightly together. What kind of person finds a young girl beaten nearly to death and speaks with such composure? This was the first of many red flags that would haunt Silvana in the days to come. Racing to the hospital with her husband Mariano, Silvana's world shattered when she saw her daughter. I could barely recognize my baby, she recalls, her voice breaking. Only her nose. Just her nose was familiar to me. Everything else was so swollen, so damaged. The brutal reality of what had happened to Augustina was worse than anything they could have imagined. While doctors fought to save Augustina's life, The initial police investigation took a direction that would later prove catastrophically wrong. Rather than focusing on Pablo Parra, investigators were drawn to the story of a mysterious intruder. On July 8th, they released a sketch of their prime suspect, a young man in his 20s or early 30s, with distinctive facial tattoos and the word rock tattooed across his fingers. "We were looking for a ghost," admits Detective Carlos Mendoza, who was among the first assigned to the case. "We had this image of a tattooed criminal, while the real killer was right there, playing the role of the concerned neighbor." The release of the sketch and a reward of 1 million pesos for information marked a critical misstep in the investigation. While police resources were directed toward finding this non-existent suspect, Parra remained free, even attending vigils for Augustina and offering support to her family. But Silvana couldn't shake her suspicions. "Why would my daughter fight so hard to protect someone else's belongings?" she questioned. This wasn't her apartment. These weren't her things. It made no sense. Her maternal instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong with Parra's story. The initial evidence seemed to support the robbery theory. Both Augustina's and Parra's phones were missing. A bag of clothes was gone. Even a silver rosary had disappeared. Yet when investigators arrived at the scene, they found 2 brand new cell phones and a wallet containing money, untouched on Parra's table. "The crime scene felt staged," recalls forensic investigator Laura Vasquez. "Everything was too perfect, too deliberately messy." Real robberies have a different kind of chaos. But without concrete evidence linking Parra to the attack, investigators continued pursuing the tattooed suspect theory. As Augustina lay in critical condition, supported by machines, Silvana began her own quiet investigation. She spoke with neighbors, piecing together the dynamics between her daughter and Parra. The picture that emerged was disturbing. A pattern of obsession, control, and escalating behavior that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. Diana Morales, a neighbor, finally came forward with the chilling comment she had heard Parra make about Augustina being his little treat. Other residents began sharing stories of his constant presence, his watchful eyes, his way of appearing whenever Augustina had visitors. "It was like a dam breaking," says prosecutor Martin Petzetta. "Once people started talking, the truth began pouring out. But we needed more than suspicions. We needed evidence. That evidence would come, but not before Augustina lost her fight for life." On July 5th, after 3 days of desperate medical intervention, she was declared brain dead. The investigation shifted from assault to homicide, raising the stakes and intensifying the pressure to find her killer. Silvana's grief turned to determination. "I knew in my heart who had done this," she says. "A mother knows, but I needed the world to see it too." She began speaking out, questioning the focus on the tattooed suspect, demanding that investigators look more closely at the neighbor who had inserted himself so thoroughly into her daughter's life. The initial investigation's missteps would later be scrutinized. How had they so quickly accepted Parra's version of events? Why hadn't they questioned the inconsistencies in his story more thoroughly? The answers would reveal uncomfortable truths about how cases of violence against women are sometimes investigated, and how predators can hide behind respectability and careful planning. But Silvana's intuition would ultimately be vindicated. As she stood vigil by her daughter's hospital bed, as she planned a funeral no mother should have to plan, as she watched Pablo Parra attend community gatherings in support of her daughter, she never wavered in her conviction. The truth would eventually emerge, but the cost of that delayed recognition would be measured in the precious days when evidence could have been gathered, when witnesses might have spoken up sooner, when perhaps, or just perhaps, Augustina might have been saved. A mother's intuition isn't evidence, Silvana says now, her eyes filling with tears. But it led us to the evidence. I wish they had listened sooner. Truth has a way of emerging, piece by piece, like a puzzle slowly coming together. In the case of Augustina Fernandez's murder, the critical breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a small piece of blue fabric caught on barbed wire behind the apartment complex. It seemed insignificant at first, recalls forensic investigator Marco Ruiz, holding up an evidence photograph of the fabric. Just a scrap of cloth torn on a fence. But in criminal investigations, the smallest details often tell the biggest stories. That piece of fabric would become the thread that would unravel Pablo Parra's carefully constructed alibi. The DNA analysis revealed not only Parra's genetic material on the fabric, but also showed fibers matching those found on Augustina's clothing. More importantly, this evidence placed Parra exactly where he claimed he had never been, scaling the back wall of the apartment complex on the night of the murder. Surveillance footage began to tell its own story. Cameras around the neighborhood had captured Parra's movements that evening, his visit to his father's house, the ice cream shop, the beer purchase. He wanted to be seen, explains Detective Laura Vasquez. Each stop was a deliberate performance, creating witnesses to his whereabouts. But there was a crucial gap in his timeline. This gap coincided perfectly with witness testimonies. Two neighbors, Diana Morales and Ricardo Espinoza, had heard a woman screams around 7:30 p.m., precisely during the period when Parra claimed to be running errands. Their statements, initially overlooked in the chaos of the initial investigation, now took on new significance. The screams were unmistakable, Ricardo testified. They weren't the kind of screams you hear from someone being robbed. They were desperate, pleading. Then there was this terrible silence. The timing of these screams aligned perfectly with the period when Parra had disappeared from security cameras. The physical evidence from the crime scene began to speak volumes. Dr. Elena Marquez, the forensic pathologist who examined Augustina's injuries, found patterns inconsistent with a random attack. The blows were targeted, precise, she explains. This wasn't the chaotic violence of a robbery gone wrong. This was controlled, sustained aggression from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Perhaps most damning was what investigators found in Parra's new apartment months later, the very items he had claimed were stolen during the supposed robbery. We found Augustina's phone, says Detective Vasquez, along with other items he claimed the burglar had taken. He hadn't even bothered to dispose of them properly. It was as if he thought he was untouchable. Phone records revealed another crucial detail. 2 weeks after the murder, Parra had attempted to sell $400 to a coworker. This was significant, explains Prosecutor Pizzetta, because he had claimed all his savings, approximately $1,000, had been stolen during the robbery. Where did this money come from if he had been robbed of everything? The evidence mounted in other ways. Security expert Rocio, who had trained Parra in emergency response procedures, provided crucial testimony about his capabilities. He knew exactly what to do in medical emergencies, she stated. Yet when he found Augustina, he did nothing to help her. His training should have kicked in automatically. Unless he already knew it was too late, digital forensics revealed a pattern of obsession in Parra's online behavior. His internet search history showed repeated visits to Augustina's social media profiles, searches for her name, and multiple attempts to track her activities online. It was classic stalking behavior, explains Dr. Ana Rivera, a forensic psychologist. He was monitoring her constantly, building an imaginary relationship that existed only in his mind. The DNA evidence under Augustina's fingernails, which initially didn't match Parra's, was later explained by Dr. Marquez. In cases of severe head trauma, defensive wounds aren't always present. The victim may be incapacitated before they have a chance to fight back. Each piece of evidence contributed to a devastating portrait of premeditation. The ladder used to scale the wall had been positioned days in advance. The timing of the dinner invitation was calculated to ensure Augustina would be alone. Even the staging of the robbery showed careful planning, certain items taken, others deliberately left behind to support his story. What we saw, concludes Prosecutor Pizzetta, was not just a murder, but an elaborately staged production. Every detail, from the fake robbery to the careful construction of an alibi, showed planning and forethought. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated execution. As the evidence accumulated, Parra's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The helpful neighbor, the concerned friend, the innocent bystander, each role he had played was exposed as part of an elaborate deception. The truth that emerged was far more sinister. A predator who had planned, watched, and waited, turning an apartment complex into a hunting ground, and a young woman's dreams into a nightmare. In the end, it wasn't one piece of evidence that proved decisive, but the overwhelming accumulation of proof physical, digital, and testimonial, that revealed the true face of Pablo Parra. The truth had been there all along, hidden behind a mask of normalcy, waiting to be uncovered by those determined enough to look for it. Behind every mask of normalcy can lie a monster, and Pablo Parra's facade began to crumble as those who knew him started to speak. In the months following Augustina's murder, a disturbing portrait emerged of a man whose ordinary appearance concealed years of predatory behavior and obsessive tendencies. He was like two different people, recalls Maria Torres, a former girlfriend who came forward after Augustina's death. Her voice trembles as she speaks. At first, he was charming, attentive, almost too attentive. But when things didn't go his way, there was this darkness that would come over him. Her testimony would reveal a pattern that had been repeating itself long before Augustina entered his life. Maria described incidents that now seem like clear warning signs. He would create fake social media accounts to monitor my activities. He once tried to break into my workplace after hours, claiming he was worried about me. When I confronted him, he always had an explanation that made me doubt my own judgment. Other women from Parra's past began sharing similar stories. Each account followed a chilling pattern. Initial charm giving way to obsession, rejection leading to escalating behavior, and always the need for control. He couldn't handle any form of rejection, explains Dr. Ana Mendoza, a forensic psychologist who analyzed Parra's behavior patterns. For him, rejection wasn't just emotional. It was an assault on his sense of self. The neighbors at the Confluencia Street complex, now free from fear, began sharing their observations. Diana Morales recounted the disturbing comment about Augustina being his little treat, but there was more. He would stand in the courtyard for hours, smoking cigarettes, always positioned where he could see her apartment. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at her window in the middle of the night. Particularly revealing was testimony from Parra's co-workers at the oil company. Jose Ramirez, who had worked with him for 3 years, described an incident that took on new significance after Augustina's murder. About 2 weeks after it happened, he tried to sell me $400. He was nervous, pushing for the transaction to happen quickly. This was the same man who had claimed all his money was stolen in the supposed robbery. But perhaps most chilling was how Parra had used his professional training to enhance his predatory behavior. As a safety technician, he understood emergency protocols and first aid. This knowledge made him more dangerous, explains Detective Vasquez. He knew exactly how much force to use, how to stage a crime scene, how to manipulate evidence. The investigation unveiled disturbing patterns in his daily routine. Security cameras revealed how he had methodically studied Augustina's schedule, timing his appearances to maximize contact with her. He knew when she left for classes, when she returned, when she did laundry, says Detective Vasquez. He created situations where their paths would accidentally cross. Even more disturbing was his behavior after the murder. While Augustina lay dying in the hospital, Parra attended vigils, offered support to her family, and played the role of the concerned neighbor perfectly. It was like he was enjoying it, recalls one neighbor who wishes to remain anonymous. He would discuss theories about the real killer with anyone who would listen, always steering conversations away from himself. His performance extended to his interactions with law enforcement. During initial questioning, he was cooperative to the point of being eager, volunteering information and theories about the supposed burglar. It was almost too perfect, recalls Detective Mendoza. He had an answer for everything, but looking back, every answer seemed rehearsed. The facade began to show its first cracks during the extended investigation. When confronted with evidence that contradicted his story, Parra's composed demeanor would briefly slip, revealing flashes of the rage that lay beneath. During one particularly intense interrogation, he slammed his fist on the table so hard it cracked, momentarily dropping his mask of calm rationality. Dr. Mendoza's psychological analysis revealed a personality defined by narcissistic traits and an inability to accept rejection. For someone like Parra, being rejected by a 19-year-old girl wasn't just embarrassing, it was intolerable. In his mind, if he couldn't have her, no one could. The most revealing insight came from his own words. captured in text messages and social media posts. In the months leading up to the murder, his language became increasingly possessive, referring to Augustina as mine in conversations with others, even though they had no committed relationship. What we see in Pablo Parra, concludes Dr. Mendoza, is not an anomaly, but rather a textbook case of a controlling personality pushed to its violent extreme. The careful grooming, the escalation of controlling behavior, the final explosive violence when control was lost, these are patterns we see repeatedly in cases of femicide. Perhaps most tragic is how ordinary Parra appeared to the outside world. He held a steady job, maintained professional relationships, and seemed, by all external measures, to be a functioning member of society. This ordinary facade made him more dangerous, allowing him to hide in plain sight until it was too late. The truth about Pablo Parra serves as a chilling reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like neighbors, like colleagues, like friends. And in that banality lies their greatest danger, the ability to move through the world undetected, until the moment they choose to reveal their true nature. On May 6, 2024, in a packed courtroom in Cipolletti, the trial of Pablo Parra began. The air was thick with tension as Silvana Capello, wearing a purple ribbon symbolizing the fight against femicide, walked past the man accused of murdering her daughter. It would be the first of many difficult moments in a trial that would captivate Argentina and expose the devastating reality of gender violence. "It's going to hurt to go through all of this," Silvana told reporters before entering the courtroom, "but I know it's necessary for my daughter to get justice." Her words would prove prophetic as the trial unfolded over 10 grueling days, bringing to light every painful detail of Augustina's final hours. Prosecutor Martin Pizzetta opened the proceedings with a powerful statement that set the tone for what was to come. "This is not a story about a robbery gone wrong," he declared. "This is a story about a man who believed he owned a young woman, and when she dared to live her own life, he decided to end it." The prosecution's case was methodically constructed around 4 key elements: obsession, rejection, premeditated attack, and cover-up. Over 100 witnesses would take the stand, each adding another piece to the devastating puzzle of Augustina's murder. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Officer Mariana Hurkel, who was first to arrive at the scene. Breaking down on the stand, she described finding Augustina barely alive, while Parra showed more concern for his allegedly stolen possessions than for the dying young woman. Her head was disfigured, Hurkel testified, her voice breaking, but he just kept talking about the robbery. The forensic evidence, presented by Dr. Elena Marquez, painted a horrific picture of Augustina's final moments. "The injuries tell us she fought hard for her life," Dr. Marquez explained, using 3D reconstructions to demonstrate the sequence of the attack. The broken fingers on her left hand show she tried to defend herself. The fatal blows came later, delivered with calculated force. Defense attorney Juan Manuel Cotto attempted to maintain the robbery narrative, focusing on the DNA evidence under Augustina's fingernails that didn't match Parra's. However, this strategy began to unravel as expert testimony explained how the severity and suddenness of the attack might have prevented defensive wounds from containing the attacker's DNA. The trial took a dramatic turn when Parra's cousin, a public defender, was revealed to have shared confidential information with him during the early stages of the investigation. An audio recording of their conversation exposed attempts to manipulate the investigation, leading to a separate ethics investigation. Former partners of Parra provided damning testimony about his controlling behavior and inability to accept rejection. One ex-girlfriend described how he had stalked her after their breakup, creating false social media accounts to monitor her activities. "When I see what happened to Augustina," she testified, "I realize how close I came to the same fate." Throughout the proceedings, Parra maintained his composure, speaking only once for approximately 35 seconds to proclaim his innocence. His calm demeanor, noted by many observers, seemed to work against him, appearing more calculated than genuine. The prosecution's closing arguments were powerful. Augustina Fernandez was not just killed, Prosecutor Pizzetta declared. She was punished for daring to say no, for choosing her own path, for refusing to be controlled. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was an execution. On May 15, 2024, After deliberating for several hours, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as Pablo Parra was found guilty of femicide with aggravating circumstances. When the verdict was read, Silvana Capello embraced her husband, their tears mixing with those of supporters who had followed the case from the beginning. The sentencing phase followed on June 7, 2024, where Judge Guillermo Bacuro Lascano handed down the only sentence possible under Argentine law for such a conviction: life imprisonment. The sentence was met with applause from the gallery, while Parra showed no visible reaction. "To you, Mr. Parra," Augustina says, "no is no," Silvana declared in her victim impact statement, her voice strong despite her tears. "You took her life, but you cannot take her truth." The verdict and sentence marked a significant moment in Argentina's ongoing struggle with femicide. The case highlighted how the justice system handles cases of gender violence and the importance of recognizing warning signs before they escalate to tragedy. Defense attorney Cotto announced plans to appeal, citing concerns about evidence handling and jury instructions. However, the appellate court would later uphold both the conviction and sentence, noting the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Parra. For Augustina's family, the conclusion of the trial brought a measure of closure, though the pain of their loss remains eternal. "Justice has been served," Silvana told reporters outside the courthouse, "but no verdict can bring back my daughter. Now we must ensure her story helps protect other young women." The trial of Pablo Parra became more than just a legal proceeding. It became a mirror reflecting society's ongoing struggle with gender violence, power, and control. It showed how justice, though sometimes slow, can eventually prevail, and how one young woman's tragic death could catalyze important conversations about violence against women in Argentina and beyond.
Please send someone, please. I want to kill my family.
Someone took your family?
Somebody killed my came home, my family's dead. My wife, my son, my granddaughter's dead.
Hold on. Is it an apartment or a resident?
This is a resident.
Resident. What's your name?
My name is Robert Short. Robert Short. I checked up for people, but they've been beaten.
It was just another Monday morning in Columbus, Georgia, January 4th, 2016. Nobody expected anything unusual that day, but this single phone call would reveal something nobody saw coming: a family torn apart from the inside. 3 people dead: a grandmother, her teenage son, and a little 10-year-old girl. And the killer? He wasn't some stranger who broke in. He was family, someone they trusted, someone they loved, someone who sat at their dinner table and shared their holidays. That's what makes this story so terrifying. It shows how the people closest to us can sometimes be the most dangerous. Dawn had barely broken over the quiet neighborhoods of Columbus, Georgia, on that frigid January morning in 2016. The air hung heavy with an unseasonal chill that seemed to whisper of the horror about to unfold. For Robert Short, it began as just another ordinary Monday, following the familiar rhythm of his daily routine. But fate had scripted a different story for him that day, one that would forever alter the fabric of his life and send shockwaves through the peaceful community of Upatoy. As Robert's car turned onto his street, the first hints that something was terribly wrong began to surface. His eyes caught the garage door standing open, an unusual sight that made his heart skip a beat. The space where his wife's silver 2014 Volkswagen Beetle should have been gaped empty, and his green GMC, which typically sat in the driveway, was nowhere to be seen. A cascade of small details began to paint a picture of wrongness. The attic door hanging askew, his wife's hat discarded on the concrete, and most disturbing of all, the telltale darkness of dried blood near the entrance. His hands trembling, Robert approached the kitchen door leading from the garage. It stood slightly ajar, another deviation from the normal order of his household. As he pushed it open, the silence that greeted him was deafening. No welcoming call from Gloria, his wife of nearly 20 years. No sound of his teenage son Caleb's video games, or the cheerful giggling of his granddaughter Gianna, whom everyone lovingly called Gigi. "Gloria," he called out. his voice echoing through the unnaturally still house. The response was silence, broken only by the sound of his own rapidly beating heart. The horror unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. In the hallway, he found Gloria lying face down, motionless. His mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. As he reached down with trembling fingers to check for a pulse, he somehow knew he wouldn't find. The chill of her skin confirmed his worst fears. Panic rising in his throat, Robert stumbled through the house, calling out for his son and granddaughter. In the living room, the sight of 10-year-old Gigi's small form, laid out like a broken doll, brought him to his knees. The innocent child who had brought so much joy to their lives lay still, her presence reduced to an unthinkable tableau of violence. Desperate hope drove him forward, searching for his 17-year-old son Caleb. The search led him to the master bedroom's walk-in closet, where he found the final piece of this grotesque puzzle, Caleb's bound form, showing no signs of life. With hands shaking so violently he could barely operate his phone, Robert dialed 911. His voice, when it finally came, emerged as a broken whisper. "Someone please, I came home. My family dead. Son. My dead." The dispatcher's calm voice seemed to come from a different universe, one where such horrors didn't exist. As police sirens began to wail in the distance, Robert Short stood in his once peaceful home, now transformed into a crime scene, his world shattered beyond recognition. Corporal John Papey had seen his share of violence during his military service, but nothing had prepared him for the scene that awaited him in the quiet Upatoy neighborhood that morning. As he pulled his cruiser to a stop on the street, the winter sun cast long shadows across the driveway where Robert Short stood, a shell-shocked figure barely able to form coherent sentences. The garage door gaped open like a wound in the house's facade, revealing scattered evidence of the violence that had occurred within. Arrows from the attic lay scattered across the concrete floor, and the hanging attic door swung slightly in the morning breeze. The illuminated attic light cast an eerie glow over the scene, highlighting dark stains that the experienced officer immediately recognized as dried blood. With practiced precision, Papey and his fellow officers coordinated their movements through the house. Each step revealed new horrors that even seasoned law enforcement officers found difficult to process. The first victim, Gloria Short, lay in a pool of blood at the end of the hallway, her body bound with a grotesque combination of blue painter's tape and duct tape. The careful, methodical nature of the bindings spoke of premeditation rather than chaos. In the living room, the scene became even more heartbreaking. 10-year-old Gianna's small form lay face up, her injuries particularly brutal for one so young. Beside her, a 20-pound dumbbell bore silent witness to the violence, its surface stained with blood. Lieutenant Mike Myand, surveying the scene, felt his professional detachment waver at the sight of such senseless brutality inflicted on a child. The final victim, 17-year-old Caleb, was discovered in the master bedroom's walk-in closet. The grass clinging to his socks told its own story. He had spent time outside, likely during the initial confrontation. This detail would later prove crucial to understanding the sequence of events. Detective Alan Malone, taking in the size of the residence, knew they faced a massive task in processing the scene. Every room held potential evidence. Every surface might contain the key to understanding what had transpired in this once peaceful home. The investigators' trained eyes noted subtle details. The carefully placed tape, the strategic positioning of the bodies, the calculated violence that suggested this was no random act of brutality. In the backyard, pieces of duct tape created a trail of breadcrumbs, leading investigators to begin piecing together the terrible story of that night. The scene painted a picture of a carefully planned attack that had gone terribly, brutally wrong, leaving 3 innocent lives extinguished and a community forever changed. The investigation began to unfold like a complex puzzle, each piece revealing new depths to the tragedy. Detective Alan Malone's first breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a GPS tracker silently broadcasting from one of the stolen vehicles. As investigators converged on Oakland Park, they found both missing vehicles abandoned like discarded evidence of the killer's escape. In the crime lab, technicians worked with methodical precision. Under the eerie blue glow of luminol, the vehicles began to tell their stories. The steering wheel, armrest, and gearshift illuminated with the telltale signs of blood, each glowing spot a silent witness to the violence that had occurred. DNA swabs were carefully collected from every surface the perpetrators might have touched, building a scientific narrative of the crime. Meanwhile, the community mourned. The funeral drew over 1,200 people, Gloria's former co-workers, Caleb's high school classmates, and Gigi's Girl Scout troop all gathered to say goodbye. The three coffins stood as stark reminders of lives brutally cut short. The case took an unexpected turn when a mother's conscience became too heavy to bear. Her phone call to the police station would prove to be the thread that would begin to unravel the entire case. Her son, she revealed, had been involved in the theft of the vehicles. But as investigators would soon discover, this was merely the tip of a much darker iceberg. Detective Malone's attention turned to Caleb's phone records, which revealed frequent communications with a family member named Javer Tapley. What at first appeared to be innocent cousin-to-cousin contact would soon expose a sinister plot born of jealousy and hatred. The digital breadcrumbs left behind in deleted messages and social media communications began painting a disturbing picture of premeditation and betrayal. Each interview brought new revelations. Raheem Gibson, brought in for questioning, began to crack under the weight of his conscience. His story of being merely a lookout would eventually unravel, revealing a more active role in the night's events. The investigation's focus sharpened on three suspects: Javer Tapley, the cousin who should have been family but became the architect of destruction; Raheem Gibson, whose role would prove more significant than initially claimed; and 15-year-old Rufus Burks, whose young age belied the gravity of his involvement. The truth, when it finally emerged, proved more chilling than anyone could have imagined. At the center of this tragedy stood Javer Tapley, a young man whose familiar presence in the Short household made his betrayal all the more devastating. He had shared family vacations with them, broken bread at their table, and even slept in their home. Yet beneath this facade of family ties lurked a darkness born of jealousy and resentment. In the interrogation room, Javer maintained a carefully constructed mask of innocence. "I would never have something to do with my own cousin," he insisted, his voice steady but his eyes avoiding direct contact. "I'm not that type of person," but the evidence told a different story. His deleted text messages to Caleb revealed careful planning, each message a step closer to the eventual tragedy. 19-year-old Raheem Gibson's involvement began to unravel during his interview. Unlike Javer's cool demeanor, Raheem's conscience weighed heavily on him. "I started shaking," he admitted, describing the moments after they arrived at the Short residence. His initial claim of being merely a lookout expanded into a fuller confession as the weight of his guilt became too heavy to bear. The third perpetrator, 15-year-old Rufus Burks, presented a particularly tragic figure. His youth stood in stark contrast to the gravity of his actions. Identified by a witness near the crime scene, Rufus remained silent during questioning, but his digital footprint spoke volumes. Messages between him and Javer painted a picture of premeditation that belied his young age. The trio's method of arrival at the Short residence, alternating rides on a moped, seemed almost childish when contrasted with the horror they would unleash. Javer's communication with Caleb throughout their journey showed calculated manipulation, using his cousin's trust to lure him outside. What began as a plan to steal shoes and gaming equipment escalated into something far more sinister, driven by Javer's festering jealousy of his cousin's lifestyle. In jail, Javer's true nature emerged through conversations with his cellmate. "I've killed 3 people," he would boast. "You don't think I'll kill you too?" His words, reported back to investigators, revealed not remorse but a chilling pride in his actions. "I wish I could do it again," he reportedly said, the words of a young man whose jealousy had corrupted any sense of family loyalty or human compassion. The cold January night concealed 3 figures moving through the shadows of Columbus, Georgia. Their chosen method of transportation, a single moped they took turns riding, seemed almost comically inadequate for the horror they were about to unleash. Javer Tapley, the architect of what was to come, maintained steady communication with his cousin Caleb throughout their approach, each message bringing them closer to their target. The plan had been carefully crafted, though its full scope remained hidden from some of its participants. What Raheem Gibson believed would be a simple burglary, and what Rufus Burks might have thought was just a chance to steal some shoes, was something far more sinister in Javer's mind. The years of perceived slights and jealousy had crystallized into a deadly purpose. When they reached the Short residence, their roles fell into place with practiced precision. Javer, exploiting the trust built through years of family connection, approached the house alone. His phone buzzed with a final message to Caleb, using their cousin bond to lure the unsuspecting teenager outside. The other two waited in the shadows, their presence unknown to their target. The moment Caleb stepped outside, the facade of family friendship shattered. Javer's attack was swift and brutal, catching his cousin completely off guard. The grass that would later be found on Caleb's socks told the silent story of his struggle in the backyard. Despite his size and strength, Caleb found himself overwhelmed as Rufus joined in, helping to subdue him while Raheem watched, frozen in claimed reluctance. The binding came next, blue painter's tape and duct tape applied with terrible efficiency. Caleb's desperate questions, why, you better be playing, went unanswered as they forced him back into his own home through his bedroom window. What followed was 30 minutes of methodical horror. The trio moved through the house with purpose, encountering Gloria and young Gianna, who likely awoke to find familiar faces transformed into monsters. They used household items as weapons, including a 20-pound dumbbell that would later be found bearing the evidence of its grim purpose. The violence escalated beyond their original plan of theft, driven by what investigators would later determine was Javer's deep-seated resentment. Each victim was bound, each subjected to brutal assault, their final moments witnessed by people they had once trusted and loved. When it was over, the killers began collecting their spoils, boxes of Jordan sneakers, Nike shoes, gaming consoles, and other items that seemed trivial compared to the lives they had taken. They loaded their stolen goods into Gloria's Volkswagen Beetle, then took the family's GMC as well, a final insult to the home they had violated. The vehicles, later abandoned at Oakland Park, would become crucial evidence in unraveling their crimes. Justice, when it finally came, arrived with the full weight of Georgia state law. In the hushed courtroom, the evidence painted a picture so horrific that even seasoned legal professionals struggled to maintain their composure. The prosecution laid bare the brutal details. 3 innocent lives extinguished through calculated violence, a family betrayed by one of their own, and a crime scene that spoke of unimaginable cruelty. Javer Tapley, the architect of this tragedy, faced the consequences of his actions first. His guilty plea to 3 counts of malice murder couldn't erase the smirk that occasionally played across his face during proceedings. The judge, noting his utter lack of remorse and the particularly heinous nature of his crimes, handed down the maximum sentence, 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His incarceration would ensure he'd never again walk free, a fitting punishment for someone who had violated the sacred trust of family in the most horrific way imaginable. Raheem Gibson's cooperation with prosecutors earned him a measure of leniency, though the term leniency seemed almost inappropriate given the gravity of the crimes. His testimony against Rufus Burks, combined with his guilty plea to 3 counts of malice murder, resulted in a 30-year sentence. The prosecution's deal acknowledged his lesser role while ensuring he would still pay a significant price for his part in the murders. The case of Rufus Burks presented unique challenges due to his age. At 15, he was the youngest of the killers, but the brutality of his actions belied his youth. Unlike his co-defendants, Burks chose to stand trial. His defense team attempted to paint him as a peripheral participant who had left before the murders occurred, but the jury saw through this facade. The evidence, including his participation in binding and beating the victims, proved too overwhelming to ignore. Found guilty of felony murder and kidnapping, he received 2 concurrent life sentences plus 15 years. The peculiarities of Georgia law regarding juvenile offenders meant that Burks, despite his heinous crimes, couldn't be sentenced to life without parole. This legal technicality ensures he will be eligible for parole after serving 30 years, a fact that continues to haunt the victim's family. Detective Malone, reflecting on the case, expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, but acknowledged the impossible task of finding punishment appropriate for such unconscionable acts. The ripples of tragedy continue to wash over the Short family long after the court proceedings ended. For Shamika, the loss of her mother Gloria, her brother Caleb, and her daughter Gianna carved a void that no justice system could fill. The betrayal cut especially deep. Javer had been more than just a cousin. He had been welcomed into their lives as family, sharing their vacations, their meals, their trust. "My mother was everybody's mom," Shamika recalled, her voice thick with emotion. "She was loved by all." The special bond between Gloria and her granddaughter Gigi had been beautiful to witness, making their joint loss all the more devastating. For Shamika, the weight of being both a grieving daughter and a mother robbed of her child created a unique burden of sorrow. Lindsay Robertson, Shamika's sister, struggles daily with the knowledge of all that was stolen from them. "Caleb and Gigi didn't get to live their lives," she said, her words carrying the weight of unrealized futures. "Gigi didn't get to go to middle school, high school, have a dance, or experience her first boyfriend. These normal milestones, forever unreached, haunt the family's thoughts. The trauma manifests in unexpected ways." Lindsay's daughter sometimes pretends that Gigi, Caleb, and Gloria have come to visit. The family plays along with these imaginative scenarios, finding a bittersweet comfort in these moments of make-believe connection. It's their way of keeping the memories alive while processing their immeasurable loss. Perhaps most painful is the knowledge that this wasn't the act of a stranger, but someone they had nurtured and trusted. During summer visits, they had opened their home to Javer, shared their family's intimate moments, and even bought him clothes. Gloria's generosity had extended to him as if he were her own, making his betrayal all the more incomprehensible. The family's grief has become a complex tapestry of memories, both cherished and painful. They remember Gloria's energetic presence, Caleb's shy smile, and Gigi's infectious laughter. Yet these sweet recollections are now forever intertwined with the horror of their final moments and the betrayal that led to their deaths. It's a burden the surviving family members carry every day, their lives forever marked by an absence that no court verdict could ever fill. At 8:15 a.m. on March 31st, 2023, Madeline Kingsbury sent her last text message. No one realized this ordinary Friday in Winona, Minnesota would spiral into one of the state's most chilling investigations. As evening descended, her sister Krista stared at her phone, watching messages pile up unanswered, something unprecedented for the usually responsive 26-year-old mother of two. The day had started routinely enough. Madeline, known affectionately as Maddie, dropped her children at daycare alongside their father, Adam Fravel. But when her friend knocked on her door that evening, she found Maddie's minivan sitting empty in the driveway, her phone abandoned inside the house, and her work bag untouched, signs that would soon take on a sinister significance. Adam's account of that morning quickly began unraveling. He claimed they'd parted ways after daycare, saying Maddie had a meeting before heading to work in Rochester. She would take his car, he said. Yet his car remained in the driveway, and her jacket hung untouched in the closet. Between 9:45 and 10 a.m., surveillance cameras captured Adam doing something suspicious, methodically switching the license plates between Maddie's minivan and his own vehicle. By 8:20 p.m., with Maddie still unreachable, her family contacted the Winona Police Department. Officers arriving at her residence found a house frozen in time, everything in place except its owner. But as they began digging deeper, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that had been building for months. What emerged was a story far darker than a simple disappearance. In the weeks before March 31st, Adam had shown an obsessive interest in another missing persons case, that of Gabby Petito. He had made comments that now seemed less like casual conversation and more like foreshadowing. And in the 24 hours before Maddie vanished, he had systematically disabled all location tracking on his devices. The peaceful city of Winona, known for its stunning river bluffs and close-knit community, was about to become the epicenter of a case that would reveal how domestic abuse can hide behind closed doors, how obsession can turn deadly, and how a seemingly perfect life can mask a nightmare in the making. As spring temperatures rose and snow melted away, One question haunted investigators. What happened in those crucial hours after 8:15 a.m.? The answer would prove more disturbing than anyone could have imagined, leading to a culvert near a rural gravel road, where a family member's property held a secret that would break the case wide open. Behind the headlines of Madeline Kingsbury's disappearance was a woman whose achievements belied her young age. At just 26, Maddie had built an impressive career at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where she worked as a clinical research coordinator. Her colleagues described her as meticulous, dedicated, and always eager to learn, traits that served her well as she simultaneously pursued a master's degree in public health administration at the University of Minnesota. Born June 1, 1996, in Winona, Maddie was the youngest of 3 children. Growing up alongside her sister Megan and brother Stephen, she developed a reputation for being the family's bright spark. Her childhood friends remember her as the one who could light up any room, whether she was organizing study groups or planning weekend adventures. This natural leadership would later define her professional life. What made Maddie's accomplishments even more remarkable was that she achieved them while raising 2 young children, aged 5 and 2. Her mornings began before sunrise, coordinating daycare schedules and work meetings. Evenings were spent between bedtime stories and master's degree assignments. She moved through life with a determination that inspired those around her. At the Mayo Clinic, Maddie's work involved coordinating complex medical research projects, a role that demanded precision, interpersonal skills, and unwavering dedication. Her supervisor would later tell investigators that she never missed a day of work without notice, making her silence on March 31st all the more alarming. But beneath this picture of professional success lay a more complicated personal life. While Maddie excelled in her career, she struggled with a relationship that increasingly showed signs of toxicity. Friends noticed how she would brush off concerning incidents with practiced casualness, always finding ways to explain away the unexplainable. Text messages recovered from her phone revealed a woman trying to maintain normalcy for her children while quietly planning an escape. In the weeks before her disappearance, she had been researching apartments in Winona, saving listings in her browser, and confiding in close friends about her plans to leave. She had even begun seeing someone new, a former college classmate named Spencer, though she kept this relationship carefully guarded, knowing how Adam might react. Her sister Megan would later tell investigators that Maddie had a habit of seeing the best in people, even when they showed her their worst. This quality, admirable as it was, may have kept her tethered to a situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous. Despite her professional success and growing independence, Maddie remained committed to making things work for her children's sake, a dedication that would ultimately put her in harm's way. In her final weeks, Maddie had started leaving digital breadcrumbs, screenshots of threatening messages, notes about concerning incidents, and conversations with friends about her fears. It was as if some part of her knew she needed to create a record, even as she continued to navigate her daily life with characteristic grace and resilience. These glimpses into Maddie's life would later become crucial pieces of evidence, painting a picture not just of who she was, but of the mounting tensions that preceded her disappearance. Her story would serve as a stark reminder that success and strength don't make someone immune to domestic violence. Sometimes, they can make it harder for others to see the danger hiding in plain sight. Behind Adam Fravel's outward appearance of a stay-at-home dad lurked a more complex and troubling figure. After losing his advertising job during the 2020 pandemic, Adam's life took a sharp turn, but not toward domestic responsibility. Instead of stepping up to support Maddie, who continued working at Mayo Clinic while pursuing her master's degree, he retreated into a world of video games and mounting obsessions. Former classmates from Winona State University remembered Adam as an unremarkable management information systems student who dropped out after Maddie became pregnant with their first child. While she pushed forward with her education and career, he drifted between jobs in digital advertising, never quite finding his footing before the pandemic gave him an excuse to stop trying altogether. But it was his growing fixation with the Gabby Petito case that would later send chills through investigators. In autumn 2021, when the story of the young vlogger's disappearance and murder dominated headlines, Adam became consumed. Friends reported how he would analyze every detail, watching news coverage repeatedly, speaking about Brian Laundrie's actions with an unsettling familiarity that made them uncomfortable. His digital footprint revealed a man increasingly losing grip on reality. While claiming to be a devoted father, he spent up to 12 hours daily gaming, leaving household responsibilities to Maddie. His browser history showed repeated searches about domestic violence cases, particularly those involving missing persons. Yet, in police interviews, he maintained a carefully constructed facade of normalcy. The controlling behavior escalated gradually. He demanded access to Maddie's phone, monitored her whereabouts through location tracking, and flew into rages when she mentioned her new friend Spencer. In one particularly disturbing incident, he pinned Maddie down and referenced the Petito case, saying she might end up like Gabby if she didn't learn to mind. When later questioned about this, he dismissed it as just a joke, his voice carrying an unsettling casualness. Financial records painted a picture of complete dependence on Maddie. While she worked tirelessly, he contributed nothing to the household income. Yet he maintained control over their finances, closely monitoring her spending and questioning every purchase. What caught investigators' attention was his intense interest in Maddie's workplace death benefit, a $170,000 policy he had inquired about multiple times in the months before her disappearance. Most telling were his actions in the 24 hours before Maddie vanished. With methodical precision, he disabled location tracking on every device he owned, removed security cameras from their home, and began laying groundwork for what he likely hoped would be an airtight alibi. These weren't the actions of a panicked man in the heat of the moment. They were calculated moves by someone who had studied other cases and learned from their mistakes. Adam's behavior after Maddie's disappearance further raised red flags. While her family organized searches and her sister launched a viral TikTok campaign, he remained notably absent. His statement through his attorney claimed police had advised him not to participate in searches, a claim investigators would later dispute. He positioned himself as a concerned father while actively avoiding the community's efforts to find Maddie. The picture that emerged was of a man who had spent months, perhaps years, preparing for a moment of violence, studying other cases, learning from their errors, and meticulously planning his actions. His obsession with the Petito case wasn't just morbid fascination. It was research, and as investigators would discover, he had learned his lessons well, perhaps too well. Over 7 years, Maddie and Adam's relationship had become a textbook case of escalating domestic tension. What began during their college days at Winona State University as an unplanned pregnancy forcing them to stick it out had evolved into a complex web of financial dependence, emotional manipulation, and mounting fear. Their dynamic shifted dramatically after Adam lost his job in 2020. While Maddie threw herself into her career at Mayo Clinic, Adam retreated into their home, but not as the supportive partner she needed. Friends witnessed a parasitic relationship forming. Maddie worked full-time, pursued her master's degree, and cared for their 2 children, while Adam spent his days gaming, contributing nothing to household maintenance or childcare despite being home constantly. Text messages recovered from Maddie's phone revealed years of walking on eggshells. "I have to turn off my location when I visit Spencer," she confided to a friend. "Otherwise, he'll blow up my phone until I respond." Spencer, a former college classmate who had recently reconnected with Maddie, became a particular trigger point. Adam, who had been in the same fraternity as Spencer years earlier, couldn't tolerate even hearing his name. The financial imbalance created its own strain. As the sole breadwinner, Maddie shouldered all household expenses, yet Adam maintained rigid control over their finances. Bank records showed a pattern. Maddie's paychecks deposited, bills paid, and Adam withdrawing cash for what he called household expenses, but which primarily funded his gaming habits. Violence entered their relationship gradually. Then suddenly, a 2020 FaceTime call captured a disturbing incident. Adam striking Maddie across the face during an argument about household cleanliness. The friend on the other end of the call would later tell investigators this wasn't an isolated incident. Bruises appeared with increasing frequency, always with plausible explanations that grew thinner over time. Their cycle of breaking up and reconciling became notorious among friends. Maddie would gather the courage to end things, Adam would promise changes, and the pattern would reset. By early 2023, They were technically separated but still living together, a dangerous arrangement that friends and family had repeatedly warned against. Maddie's father had stopped speaking to Adam entirely, telling his daughter bluntly, "He's going to kill you." Her father's words, tragically prophetic, came after witnessing years of Adam's manipulation tactics firsthand. Yet Maddie, ever hopeful and concerned about their children's stability, continued trying to make the situation work. In the weeks before her disappearance, Maddie had begun secretly viewing apartments. Her browser history showed searches for single-parent resources and domestic violence support groups. She was planning an exit, but carefully aware that the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is often when the victim tries to leave. The relationship's final days were marked by increasing tension. Adam had discovered Maddie's growing connection with Spencer, and his behavior became more erratic. Surveillance footage from their home showed frequent arguments, with Adam following Maddie from room to room, gesturing aggressively. Yet publicly, he maintained the image of a concerned partner, even as he methodically prepared for what investigators would later believe was a premeditated act. Their last day together, March 31st, 2023, began with a routine they'd established, dropping the kids at daycare together. But something was different that morning. Adam had spent the previous night disabling tracking devices and removing security cameras. He had studied other cases, learned from their mistakes, and was ready to ensure the separation would be permanent. March 31st, 2023, began with a deceptively normal routine in Winona, Minnesota. At 8 a.m., surveillance cameras captured Maddie and Adam dropping their children off at daycare together. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Maddie alive. At 8:15 a.m., she sent her final text message, a routine work-related communication that gave no hint of the horror about to unfold. What happened in the next few hours would later be pieced together through a complex web of surveillance footage, cell phone data, and Adam's increasingly contradictory statements. According to Adam's initial account to police, after daycare drop-off, they'd returned home where Maddie mentioned having a meeting before heading to work in Rochester. She would take his car, he claimed, while he used her minivan to transport items to his parents' house in Mabel. But surveillance footage told a different story. Between 9:45 and 10 a.m., cameras captured Adam outside their home engaged in a suspicious activity, methodically switching the license plates between Maddie's minivan and his own vehicle. This calculated move, investigators would later conclude, showed premeditation rather than panic. The critical 45-minute window between 11:59 a.m. and 12:44 p.m. would become the focus of intense scrutiny. During this time, Adam's movements couldn't be accounted for through any surveillance footage. The minivan was last seen driving south at 11:59 a.m., then reappeared driving north at 12:44 p.m. When investigators later drove this route themselves, they found the timing suspiciously precise, suggesting Adam had made no significant stops or detours during this window. Yet Adam's story kept shifting. First, he claimed he'd driven to Mabel, realized he had the wrong items, and returned home. Then he mentioned stopping at a storage unit. When pressed about the license plate swap, he had no explanation. His text messages to Maddie throughout the day, which initially appeared to show concern, began to look more like carefully crafted breadcrumbs creating an alibi. Back at their home, everything was eerily preserved. Maddie's jacket hung in the closet. Her work bag sat untouched. Adam's car, the one she supposedly planned to drive to work, remained in the driveway. Her phone, wallet, and ID lay abandoned inside the house. Nothing suggested she had planned to leave. Everything suggested she never had the chance. When police asked Adam about zip ties found in the minivan, his response raised red flags. Maybe her dad used them for repairs, he suggested vaguely, though investigators would later find the same type of zip ties in a recent purchase he'd made. The minivan's interior had been meticulously cleaned, too clean for a vehicle supposedly used for moving storage items. As the day progressed into evening, Maddie's absence became increasingly concerning to her family. Her sister Krista's unanswered texts accumulated. Her mother's calls went straight to voicemail. By 8:20 p.m., when police conducted their initial welfare check, Adam was notably absent, having taken the children to his parents' house in Mabel. conveniently removing himself from the immediate investigation. The timestamp on Maddie's last text, 8:15 a.m., would hang over the investigation like a dark cloud. In the hours that followed, Adam had systematically created what he thought was a perfect cover story. But like the switched license plates, each detail he arranged would eventually help build the case against him, revealing not a series of coincidences, but a carefully orchestrated plan with a horrifying conclusion. The evening of March 31st transformed from concern to crisis when Maddie's friend arrived at her darkened house at 8:20 p.m. With Maddie's minivan in the driveway but no response to knocks, the Winona Police Department received their first call about the disappearance of Madeline Kingsbury. The initial police response seemed routine, a welfare check for a missing adult. But within hours, red flags began accumulating. Officers noted the strange presence of all Maddie's personal items: phone, wallet, jacket, work bag. Her car sat in the driveway, yet Adam's story about her planning to drive his vehicle to work didn't align with the untouched scene. As dawn broke on April 1st, Maddie's sister Megan took an unprecedented step that would transform a local missing persons case into a national story. Her first TikTok video, raw and emotional, launched what would become a powerful social media campaign. "This is my sister, Madeline Kingsbury. She's missing. This is just very basic info we've put on flyers around town. Pause if you need to read more." The videos quickly went viral, drawing thousands of volunteers to Winona. Megan posted daily updates, each one more desperate than the last. Day 13, still haven't found my sister. Keeping Maddie's name in the news, her strategic use of social media created unprecedented pressure on both law enforcement and, unknowingly, on Adam. Meanwhile, the search effort expanded rapidly. Over 2,000 volunteers combed through the southeastern Minnesota countryside, focusing particularly on the routes between Winona and Mabel. Search teams navigated difficult terrain, steep bluffs, dense woods, and numerous water features that could hide crucial evidence. The investigation gained momentum when police discovered Maddie's phone data. Her last text at 8:15 a.m. became a crucial timestamp, marking the moment her digital presence abruptly ended. More telling was Adam's digital footprint, or rather, its suspicious absence. Investigators found he had systematically disabled all location tracking on his devices the day before Maddie's disappearance. Police interviews with Maddie's colleagues revealed another crucial detail. She had a significant death benefit through her employer, worth $170,000. Adam had inquired about this policy multiple times in recent months, a fact that shifted investigators' focus from missing person to potential homicide. The Kingsbury family offered a $50,000 reward, generating dozens of tips daily through Crime Stoppers. Each lead was methodically investigated, but one pattern emerged: consistently reports of a suspicious minivan in the rural areas between Winona and Mabel on the morning of March 31st. As the investigation intensified, Adam's behavior drew increasing scrutiny. While thousands searched for Maddie, he remained notably absent from all community efforts. Through his attorney, he claimed police had advised him against participating in searches, a statement law enforcement would later publicly dispute. By mid-April, the case had captured national attention. Megan's TikTok updates reached millions, drawing parallels to other high-profile disappearances. The pressure mounted as each day passed without answers, but investigators knew they were building something significant, a case that would eventually reveal how thoroughly Adam had studied other crimes, and how this knowledge would ultimately lead to his undoing. As investigators pieced together Madeline Kingsbury's final hours, a damning trail of evidence began to emerge. Like a puzzle slowly taking shape, each new discovery revealed Adam Fravel's careful planning and his crucial mistakes. Security camera footage became the investigation's backbone. Starting at 9:45 a.m. on March 31st, cameras captured Adam's first suspicious act, methodically switching license plates between Maddie's minivan and his car. This wasn't a panicked response to crisis. It was calculated preparation. When questioned, Adam had no explanation for the switch, marking the first crack in his carefully constructed narrative. Digital forensics revealed an even more telling pattern. On March 30th, The day before Maddie's disappearance, Adam had systematically disabled location tracking on every device he owned: his iPhone, iCloud account, car GPS, and even advertising trackers. He'd also removed security cameras from both their home and his parents' residence. These weren't the actions of someone reacting to tragedy. They were the preparations of someone planning one. The investigation's most crucial break came from a neighbor's trail camera. 10 days after Maddie's disappearance, footage emerged showing Adam driving a UTV through wooded areas near his parents' property, a shovel clearly visible in the back. This same area would later become the focus of intense police scrutiny. Inside Adam and Maddie's home, investigators found signs of hasty cleaning. A gray-fitted bedsheet was missing from their bed, a detail that seemed minor until June 7th. Additionally, in the trash at Adam's parents' house, police discovered Maddie's burned laptop and several of her electronic devices, raising immediate red flags. The timeline gaps proved equally revealing. Between 11:59 a.m. and 12:44 p.m. on March 31st, Adam's movements couldn't be traced. A 45-minute window that investigators determined was just enough time to drive to the rural location where Maddie's body would eventually be found. When police drove the route themselves, they found Adam's timing suspiciously precise. Cell phone records showed a complete cessation of Maddie's normal activity after 8:15 a.m. Her regular pattern of work emails, text messages, and calls simply stopped. Meanwhile, Adam's phone showed a series of seemingly manufactured text messages to Maddie throughout the day, messages that investigators believed were sent to create an alibi. Physical evidence mounted in the minivan. Police found zip ties matching those later discovered with Maddie's remains. When questioned, Adam claimed they might have been left from vehicle repairs, but store receipts showed he'd purchased them recently. The vehicle's interior had been thoroughly cleaned, inconsistent with its supposed use for moving storage items. Perhaps most damning was evidence from Adam's online activity in the months leading up to Maddie's disappearance. His browser history revealed extensive research into missing persons cases, particularly the Gabby Petito case. He had studied how other perpetrators had been caught, learning from their mistakes. This research meant to help him avoid detection, instead helped build the case against him. Each piece of evidence revealed not just what happened to Maddie, but how meticulously Adam had planned her disappearance. He had studied other cases, prepared his alibis, and thought through his actions. Yet, like so many before him, he couldn't account for every detail. And it was these overlooked details that would ultimately lead investigators to a lonely culvert near a rural gravel road, where Maddie's story would reach its tragic conclusion. On June 7, 2023, 1 week after what would have been Madeline Kingsbury's 27th birthday, the investigation reached its tragic conclusion. A deputy searching a rural area near a gravel road made the discovery that would confirm the community's worst fears and bring the intensive 2-month search to an end. The location itself spoke volumes. Property maintained by a Fravel family member, situated between the towns of Choice and Mabel, not far from Adam's parents' home. In a lonely culvert beneath the road, the deputy spotted something out of place. A gray-fitted bedsheet, carefully wrapped and sealed with black Gorilla tape. It was the missing bedsheet from Maddie and Adam's home.
We are here today to announce that human remains were found yesterday in Fillmore County. This morning, the Southern Minnesota Regional Medical Examiner's Office performed an autopsy. Law enforcement has confirmed the remains are those of Madeline Kingsbury. Unfortunately, while this discovery is not what we were hoping for, we are thankful to be able to bring Maddie home to her family. Her body was found by a Fillmore County investigator on a remote stretch of road off Highway 43 north of Mabel at approximately 1:30 p.m. yesterday afternoon. Digital evidence collected by investigators led us to this area. It should be noted that the location of Maddie's body was off a low-maintenance public roadway and was not property owned by the Fravel family or any of their relatives. The area had been previously searched, but Maddie's body was covered and concealed in such a manner that she was not visible.
The scene bore hallmarks of careful planning. The culvert's location was strategic, remote enough to avoid immediate discovery, yet accessible enough for quick disposal. The choice of location suggested intimate knowledge of the area, and later investigation would reveal it was along the route captured in Adam's suspicious 45-minute timeline gap on March 31st. Forensics teams documented every detail. The gorilla tape matched a roll found in the Kingsbury Fravel residence. The bedsheet was confirmed as the one missing from their bed. Most chillingly, they discovered zip ties had been used, the same type found in Maddie's minivan, which Adam had attempted to explain away as car repair materials. Dental records and distinctive tattoos confirmed what investigators already knew. They had found Madeline Kingsbury. The medical examiner's findings painted a grim picture of her final moments. A knotted zip tie around her neck indicated a deliberate, close-range attack. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was an execution carried out with terrible precision. The location's connection to the Fravel family proved crucial. Trail camera footage from 10 days after Maddie's disappearance had captured Adam in the area, driving a UTV with a shovel. Investigators theorized he may have returned to check on or possibly relocate the body, unaware of the camera recording his movements. The culvert's discovery also explained some of Adam's suspicious behavior that March morning. The 45-minute gap in his timeline aligned perfectly with the time needed to drive to the location, dispose of Maddie's body, and return to establish his alibi. His knowledge of the area had allowed him to act quickly and efficiently. The scene processing revealed additional evidence tying Adam to the crime. Soil samples from the minivan matched the culvert area. Fiber evidence from the bedsheet was found in the vehicle despite its thorough cleaning. Each piece strengthened the case against him, proving that even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces. News of the discovery spread quickly through Winona. The community that had spent months searching for Maddie now gathered to mourn her. The culvert, once an unremarkable feature of rural Minnesota, became a somber reminder of how domestic violence can hide in plain sight until it's too late. Hours after the discovery, law enforcement moved swiftly. Adam Fravel was arrested at his parents' home, the same property near where he had hidden his crime. As he was led away in handcuffs, the carefully constructed facade he had maintained for 2 months finally cracked, revealing the truth that had been evident all along. The arrest of Adam Fravel on June 7, 2023, marked the beginning of the legal proceedings that would bring justice for Madeline Kingsbury. Initially charged with second-degree murder, prosecutors quickly elevated the charge to first-degree murder as evidence of premeditation became overwhelming. In October 2023, Adam's trial began, unfolding like a carefully constructed puzzle being solved in reverse. Prosecutors methodically presented their case. The disabled tracking devices, the switched license plates, the suspicious 45-minute window, the burned laptop, the damning trail camera footage. Each piece of evidence revealed not just what happened to Maddie, but how meticulously Adam had planned her murder. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from Maddie's friends about Adam's obsession with the Gabby Petito case. His chilling joke about Maddie ending up like Gabby now seemed less like dark humor and more like a rehearsal. The defense attempted to paint these incidents as misconstrued comments from a troubled but innocent man, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. The trial exposed the financial motive through evidence of Adam's repeated inquiries about Maddie's $170,000 death benefit. His unemployment, gaming addiction, and financial dependence on Maddie painted a picture of a man who saw murder as his path to continued financial security. The defense's attempts to explain away his interest in the death benefit fell flat against the backdrop of his premeditated actions. Throughout the trial, Adam maintained his innocence, but his carefully constructed alibis crumbled under scrutiny. The defense had little to offer beyond suggesting law enforcement had tunnel vision in focusing on Adam. They couldn't explain the mountain of evidence, from the matching tape and bedsheet to the soil samples linking the minivan to the culvert where Maddie was found. On December 17, 2024, the jury reached their verdict, guilty on all counts. Adam's final statement to the court, "I never caused harm to Maddie and I am innocent," rang hollow against the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, noting the calculated nature of the crime and its devastating impact on Maddie's children and family. The case's resolution brought changes to how Minnesota law enforcement handles domestic violence cases. Maddie's sister Megan's use of social media to maintain public interest became a model for future missing persons cases. The Kingsbury family established a foundation in Maddie's name, focusing on helping domestic violence victims with children plan safe exits from dangerous relationships. For the Winona community, the case left deep scars, but also sparked important conversations about domestic violence. Local organizations reported increased calls for help, as people recognized similar patterns in their own relationships. The Mayo Clinic, where Maddie worked, strengthened its employee support programs for domestic violence victims. Maddie's children, too young to fully understand the tragedy, were taken in by her family. The $170,000 death benefit that Adam had coveted was placed in a trust for their future education, ensuring that his final attempt to profit from Maddie's death instead became her final gift to their children. The case closed, but its impact continues to ripple through the community. Madeline Kingsbury's story became more than a tragic headline. It became a crucial reminder that domestic violence can hide behind seemingly normal facades, and that the most dangerous time often comes when victims try to leave. Her legacy lives on in changed laws, strengthened support systems, and a community forever altered by her loss.
I want to talk to you a little bit about what's on the phone. All the phones contain images of Margaret before and after her death, as well as videos of your son with her. Engaging in acts with her. Was she still alive when he was doing that? No, I don't think. Oh my God.
What drives a teenage boy to spend 2 hours in the dark with a corpse? In the quiet town of Wadsworth, Ohio, police discovered a scene that would haunt them forever. 98-year-old Margaret Douglas, stuffed into her own closet, her nightgown torn, her dignity stripped away. But it wasn't just the murder that shocked veteran detectives. It was the killer's phone. Inside a locked folder named Dark, protected by the password murder, they found videos taken between 2:09 a.m. and 4:10 a.m. The footage revealed a teenage boy, just 17 years old, documenting unspeakable acts with a jar of blackberry jam. He lived just 5 houses away, worked at the local pizza shop, and would have stayed longer if not for knowing his mother would wake at 5 a.m. What turned an ordinary teenager into something so monstrous? And how had such darkness grown unnoticed in the heart of small-town America? Spring in Wadsworth, Ohio was usually a time of renewal. In 2018, as winter melted away and flowers began to bloom, the small community of about 24,000 people went about their daily lives just as they always had. Among them was Margaret Douglas, a remarkable 98-year-old woman who had called this town home for over half a century. Margaret wasn't your typical elderly resident. At an age when most would need constant care, she lived independently in her modest home on Post Road, tending to her beloved garden and caring for her cherished dogs. Her neighbors often saw her collecting her mail or taking out her own trash, displaying a fierce independence that had carried her through nearly a century of life. Born in 1919, Margaret had lived through some of history's most defining moments. She had witnessed the Great Depression, World War II, the moon landing, and countless other historic events. As one neighbor would later recall, she wasn't what you'd expect when you think of a 98-year-old woman. She was strong, she was fierce. Margaret had a simple dream: to reach 100 years old, a milestone that seemed well within reach given her remarkable vitality. Her home on Post Road held 50 years of memories. After her husband passed away, she had refused suggestions to move into assisted living. This was her home, filled with photographs, garden tools, and the comfortable rhythms of a life well lived. She was known throughout the neighborhood for her kind heart, having once served as a babysitter for children who were now in their 80s themselves. But in April 2018, something unusual happened in this quiet corner of Wadsworth. Neighbors noticed Margaret's porch light, which usually illuminated the evening darkness, had remained unlit for several days. Her daily routines, checking the mail, tending to her garden, had suddenly stopped. In a close-knit community where neighbors looked out for each other, these small changes set off alarm bells. David, a longtime friend who had grown up near Margaret and had become something of a caretaker in recent years, was the first to raise concerns. When his knocks on her door went unanswered, an unsettling feeling began to spread through the community. Margaret Douglas, the woman who had survived nearly a century of history, had seemingly vanished from her own home. The initial response was one of concern rather than alarm. After all, this was Wadsworth, Ohio, a place where serious crime was rare, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where a 98-year-old woman could live independently without fear. Perhaps she had gone to visit family, some suggested. Others wondered if she might have fallen and needed medical attention. As police began their preliminary inquiries, no one could have imagined the dark truth that would eventually emerge. A truth that would shatter the community's sense of safety and raise disturbing questions about evil lurking in the most unexpected places. The disappearance of Margaret Douglas was about to become more than just a missing person case. It would become a story that would haunt Wadsworth for years to come. The spring breeze that rustled through Margaret's beloved garden now carried with it an unspoken question. What had happened to the strong-willed woman who had lived through nearly a century of history? The answer would prove more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The morning of April 6, 2018, brought a new intensity to Wadsworth's normally peaceful streets. Police cruisers moved slowly through the neighborhood, their presence drawing curious faces to windows and porches. The disappearance of Margaret Douglas had transformed from a welfare check into something more concerning. Detective Sarah Miller led the initial canvass of the neighborhood. Starting from Margaret's home, teams of officers went door to door, building a timeline of when residents had last seen the 98-year-old woman. Each conversation revealed small details that, like pieces of a puzzle, began to form a troubling picture. "I noticed her porch light was off," said Eric, who lived 2 houses down. "Margaret was like clockwork with that light. Every evening at dusk on it would go. But it had been dark for days." Others shared similar observations. Small disruptions in the predictable patterns of Margaret's life that now took on new significance. The Scotts, a couple who had known Margaret for years, provided their own insight. "She was definitely with it," Mrs. Scott told detectives, "though sometimes she'd tell us different ages when we spoke. But she was strong enough to take care of herself, taking out trash, getting her mail. That's what makes this so strange." As officers worked their way through the neighborhood, they encountered a particularly chatty resident, a muscular man whose initial defensive posture belied his eagerness to talk. "This neighborhood isn't what it used to be," he insisted, launching into a lengthy complaint about rental properties and changing times. "We've lived here 18 years, and I used to know every neighbor. Now, I barely know anyone." The investigation team methodically checked security cameras, interviewed mail carriers, and searched nearby areas where Margaret might have wandered. But each lead seemed to circle back to her house, where her coat still hung and her comfortable shoes remained items she would never have left behind voluntarily. Howard Leisure, Margaret's nephew, joined in the search efforts. Along with his wife Cindy, Howard had maintained close ties with his aunt, though they respected her fierce independence. When David, Margaret's friend and informal caretaker, reported that she hadn't answered her door, Howard's concern deepened. The 911 call Howard made revealed the growing anxiety. "Yes, this is Howard Leisure. My aunt lives on Page Street. A friend of ours stopped over there yesterday to check on her, and she was nowhere to be found. We don't know if you found anybody wandering." The police response intensified. They began checking every backyard, every shed, every possible place where a 98-year-old woman might have sought shelter. The community joined in, organizing search parties and sharing information on social media. Local news crews arrived, their presence adding to the growing sense that this was more than a routine missing persons case. The breakthrough, when it came, was devastating. Howard had returned to Margaret's house for another thorough search. In the bedroom closet, something caught his attention. Later, he would describe the moment to investigators. I couldn't pick up the shoe. I'm thinking, what's holding the shoe? So I took and grabbed another piece of clothing, threw it back. I've never seen this before in my life. What Howard touched felt strange, cold, clammy, like styrofoam to his fingers. As he moved more clothing aside, the horrible reality became clear. Margaret Douglas, the woman who had survived nearly a century of history, who had lived independently and brought joy to so many, lay dead in her own closet. The discovery transformed the missing persons case into a homicide investigation. Crime scene technicians descended on the house, their cameras flashing as they documented every detail. The initial examination revealed signs of violence that shocked even veteran officers. Margaret hadn't simply died, she had been killed, and the manner of her death suggested something far more sinister than a random act of violence. The community's reaction was immediate and profound. Neighbors gathered in small groups, sharing their shock and fear. Parents kept their children indoors. The easy trust that had characterized life in Wadsworth began to erode as people faced the reality that a killer had walked among them. Detective Miller established a command center in the local police station, where timelines and photographs soon covered the walls. The critical question wasn't just who had killed Margaret Douglas, but why anyone would target a beloved 98-year-old woman who had never harmed anyone in her long life. As news of the murder spread, more details emerged from the neighborhood. A woman who walked her dog in the area recalled seeing two men loitering nearby, one significantly younger than the other. She remembered them discussing foul play and making comments about Margaret B., a nice person who didn't deserve that. More disturbing was the evidence found at the crime scene. Margaret's body showed signs of both violence and something else, something that investigators initially hesitated to discuss publicly. The killer hadn't just taken her life. They had committed acts so depraved that they would later shock the entire community. The investigation was about to take an unexpected turn, leading detectives down a path that would reveal how close to home the evil really was. As one officer would later remark, "In all my years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like this. The person who did this, there was something deeply wrong with them." Meanwhile, just 5 houses away from Margaret's home, a teenager named Gavin Ramsey went about his daily routine, posting on Snapchat and attending school, while hiding secrets that would soon come to light in ways that would devastate multiple families and change Wadsworth forever. The quiet neighborhood that had been Margaret's home for half a century now held its breath, waiting for answers that would prove more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The question wasn't just who could have killed Margaret Douglas. It was who among them could have harbored such darkness in their soul. In the same neighborhood where police searched for Margaret Douglas's killer, 17-year-old Gavin Ramsey appeared to live an ordinary teenage life. He had grown up just 5 houses down from Margaret, in a home where his mother tried to keep him on a straight path despite his increasing troubles with the law. At first glance, Gavin seemed like any other high school junior. He worked at the local pizza shop, had an on-and-off girlfriend named Maddie whom he'd known since 1st grade, and spent time with his best friend Braden. But beneath this normal exterior lurked something darker, something that even those closest to him were only beginning to glimpse. He was never actually happy. His coworker Hillary would later tell investigators. He just faked it. During their shifts at the pizza shop, Gavin would confide in Hillary about feeling empty inside. He spoke of plans to catfish people online, not for money or pranks, but with the specific intention of luring them into situations where he could hurt them. Gavin's troubles weren't entirely hidden. By age 16, he had already accumulated a felony and 5 misdemeanors. His mother, struggling to control his behavior, had moved his bedroom downstairs near hers, hoping his younger brother would tattle if Gavin tried to sneak out. She restricted his freedom, limiting him to work and home for 3 months at a time. But Gavin found ways around these restrictions. He would sneak out at night, breaking into cars throughout the neighborhood. When later questioned about these break-ins, he gave a response that chilled investigators. "I don't really take anything. I just like to look inside." This admission suggested something more disturbing than typical teenage theft, a pattern of violation for the thrill of it. His online presence revealed more red flags. In group chats with friends, Gavin would make disturbing statements. "I could kill someone and not feel anything," he once wrote, adding that he wouldn't act on it because he knew it was wrong. When his girlfriend Maddie responded with shock, he brushed it off as a joke, but the comment lingered in everyone's minds. Perhaps most telling was Gavin's application to work at a local funeral home. The timing of this application, shortly before Margaret's murder, would later take on sinister significance. Though he wasn't hired, his interest in working with the dead raised questions that would later haunt investigators. As police investigated a string of local carjackings, they found themselves interviewing Gavin about an incident involving an older man he'd met on the dating app Grindr. Gavin admitted to carjacking the man but claimed it was vigilante justice, punishment for an adult willing to meet with someone who'd identified themselves as underage. During this initial interrogation, Gavin sat between his mother and a male officer, while a female detective asked questions. His behavior was notably strange, fidgeting with tissues, alternating between emotional outbursts and calm manipulation. When discussing his crimes, he showed more concern for their impact on his family's reputation than for his victims. Unknown to investigators at the time, Gavin's phone held dark secrets. In a locked folder named Dark with the password Murder, he had stored disturbing media files. His search history showed an obsession with local crimes, particularly Margaret's disappearance searches made before her death was public knowledge. His personal writings, found in a purple notebook under his bed, revealed more troubling signs. The first pages contained research on notorious serial killers, particularly those known for necrophilia. These weren't just casual interests. They were detailed studies that would later prove relevant to the horror discovered in Margaret's home. Gavin's friends noticed changes in him. Maddie would check his Snapchat location at 3 a.m., finding him in random locations despite his curfew. At a movie theater, he told friends he wouldn't care if someone held a gun to Maddie's head. He would just watch. These casual comments about violence and death created an unsettling pattern that friends struggled to understand. His relationship with his parents was complicated. After one fight with his father, Gavin attempted to choke himself, whether as manipulation or genuine distress remained unclear. His mother's responses to his behavior ranged from strict control to apparent denial, often focusing on his language, "Stop cussing," rather than addressing his deeper issues. While investigators worked to solve Margaret's murder, Gavin posted a Snapchat showing police cars outside his window with the caption, "That's crazy." He searched online for updates about the case, then carefully deleted his search history. But digital forensics would later recover these deleted searches, showing his morbid interest in the crime he had committed. The parallel investigations, the carjackings and Margaret's murder, would soon intersect in ways that would shock the community. As one detective noted, sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't the ones hiding in shadows. They're the ones hiding in plain sight, behind ordinary faces, living in ordinary houses, just down the street from their victims. The quiet neighborhood of Wadsworth was about to learn that the monster they feared wasn't some unknown intruder. It was a teenager who had grown up among them, walked their streets, and harbored darkness that would soon reveal itself in ways that would haunt the community for years to come. As investigators pieced together the evidence, they began to see how Gavin's escalating behavior, his fascination with death, and his need for thrill-seeking had culminated in one of the most horrific crimes in Wadsworth's history. The question wasn't just how he could have done something so terrible, but how many warning signs had been missed along the way. The interrogation room at the Wadsworth Police Department had seen its share of criminals, but nothing quite like this. Gavin Ramsey sat in a chair, his lanky teenage frame hunched forward, alternating between rocking back and forth and lying on the floor in a fetal position. The female detective who had first questioned him about the carjackings was back, but this time, she knew far more than Gavin realized. "Did you know I'd be coming to see you after we got your phone?" she asked. Gavin's response was telling. "I figured as soon as I heard the knock on the door. Honestly, if my boots were tied, I think I would have ran." Outside in the lobby, his mother waited, unaware of the full horror her son was about to confess. The evidence from Gavin's phone had changed everything. The digital forensics team had discovered a locked folder named Dark, protected by the password murder. Inside, they found something that shook even veteran officers: videos and photographs documenting the last moments of Margaret Douglas's life and the unspeakable acts that followed. The first video showed Margaret asleep in her living room, filmed from inside her house. Another captured her final moments, a gloved hand visible around her throat. But it was what came after her death that revealed the true depths of Gavin's depravity. For 2 hours, between 2:09 a.m. and 4:10 a.m., he had stayed with Margaret's body, committing acts of and documenting everything on his phone. In the interrogation room, Gavin's demeanor shifted between emotional outbursts and eerie calm. "I'm upset," he told the detective. She responded with practiced empathy. "I know. Telling me about it isn't going to give you much relief." When questioned about entering Margaret's house, Gavin attempted to minimize his actions. "I thought I was going out that night to go through some unlocked cars," he claimed. "But instead, I saw Margaret sleeping through her window. Her back door was unlocked. If it was locked, I wouldn't have gone in." He described tripping on a chair, waking Margaret, and claimed her screams led to panic. "She reached for her phone, so I strangled her," he said matter-of-factly. The detective noted how he showed more emotion about potentially going to jail than about taking a life. The interrogation revealed disturbing insights into Gavin's mindset. He spoke about adrenaline being his true addiction. "Nothing feels wrong with me when I have adrenaline," he explained. "It's like everything's all right. You feel alive." When asked about remorse, his responses seemed rehearsed, using what psychologists call dead phrases. Empty words without genuine emotion. "I'm really sorry that I did all of this," he said mechanically. "Were you sorry before you got caught?" The detective pressed. "Yeah, like I constantly think about it a lot," Gavin replied, but his words rang hollow. When asked what he would say to Margaret if she were alive, his response was equally superficial. "I'm sorry, that never meant to happen. If I could take it back, I would." The most chilling moment came when discussing the purple substance found on his gloves. Gavin's embarrassment seemed more genuine than any remorse he'd shown for the murder. The detective had to carefully extract the truth about how he had used blackberry jam in his acts of Throughout the interrogation, Gavin's concerns remained self-centered. "I know it's going to ruin our family name," he worried. When discussing the aftermath, he focused on his own feelings. "I didn't really feel like anything had changed or had happened. I just continued to break into cars and drink and smoke dope." Meanwhile, in the lobby, Gavin's mother was about to face her own horrifying reality. When officers finally explained what they had found on her son's phone, her first question revealed the gap between perception and reality. Was she still alive when he was doing this? The evidence painted a picture of methodical horror. Medical evidence indicated it would have taken several minutes for Margaret to die. Gavin had stayed in her house for hours afterward, only leaving because he knew his mother would wake up at 5 a.m. and he needed to pretend to be asleep. The investigation revealed more disturbing details. In Gavin's room, they found Margaret's red wallet tucked beside a bottle of cologne stolen from another carjacking victim. Trophies from his crimes. His mother's words about him being compassionate and loyal to a fault now seemed like desperate denial in the face of mounting horror. As the interrogation concluded, the detective made one final observation that would prove prophetic. "Unfortunately, I think you would have hurt more people if you hadn't been caught." Gavin's response was chilling in its honesty. "I mean, it wasn't in my plan, but I could see that happening. The case had broken wide open, but the revelations weren't over." As investigators dug deeper into Gavin's background, they would uncover a pattern of escalating behavior that suggested Margaret's murder, as horrific as it was, might have been just the beginning of something even darker. The confession had answered the who and how of Margaret's murder, but the why, the depth of darkness that could drive a teenager to commit such acts, remained a question that would haunt the community of Wadsworth for years to come. The discovery of Gavin's purple notebook, found hidden under his bed, opened a window into a mind far darker than anyone had imagined. Its 70 pages began with what appeared to be research papers on notorious serial killers, Ted Bundy and Donald Gaskins, with particular attention to those who had engaged in necrophilia. But what started as apparent research soon morphed into something more personal and disturbing. This writing thing is new to me. Gavin's first journal entry began innocently enough, but the words that followed revealed a troubled mind. I hate being at home. I hate being downstairs with my family because a lot of the time I feel like I don't really belong here. I can contain my thoughts and urges most days, but sometimes I just want to go off on someone and beat them until they're not breathing anymore. The journal painted a picture of someone struggling with severe emotional disconnection. I honestly want to take someone's life, he wrote. I want to know what that would feel like, what it would feel like to stand over some dead body. More disturbing was his self-awareness. I don't feel empathy or sympathy for anybody. I wouldn't feel bad if I killed someone, but I don't want to sit in prison. His writings gradually evolved from dark thoughts to specific scenarios. He created what he called skit ideas, horror movie plots featuring his best friend Braden as a potential victim. One entry read, Introduction. Braden is playing at the park, and I am a murderer plotting how to kill him. These weren't just creative exercises. They were fantasies that seemed to grow more detailed over time. Digital forensics revealed even more disturbing patterns. Gavin's phone contained searches about Margaret Douglas before her death was public knowledge. On the day she went missing, when his mother texted about increased police presence in the neighborhood, Gavin replied casually, "Well, that's Wadsworth for you," then immediately searched for Wadsworth police reports, Margaret Douglas dead, and body found in Wadsworth, Ohio. His online conversations with friends showed a pattern of testing boundaries. To his coworker Hillary, he wrote, I honestly have two emotions and they're angry or laughing. I'm never really happy. I'm just faking it. He described watching videos of self-harm and feeling nothing but amusement. I could kill someone in cold blood and not feel guilty or sad about anything, he confided. The relationship with his mother emerged as particularly complex. During his first interrogation about the carjackings, before the murder was discovered, Gavin broke down crying about disappointing his parents. I'm costing them thousands of dollars. Constant heartbreak. I honestly probably never made either of them proud. His mother's response was telling. Instead of addressing the emotional content, she simply said, "Stop cussing." Investigators discovered that Gavin had been prescribed Zoloft in January 2018, just months before the murder. His mother would later attempt to blame the medication for his actions, claiming he became more aggressive after starting it. But records showed his violent thoughts predated the prescription. The medication hadn't created these impulses, it had simply failed to control them. Perhaps most chilling was Gavin's fascination with adrenaline. During questioning, he described it as his true addiction. When this drug kicks in, it's a sense of euphoria. It almost feels like you have increased energy and strength. You feel practically invincible. He explained breaking into cars and homes not for theft but for the thrill. That risk factor, all I've ever done is take risks because that's the only thing that makes me feel. The investigation also uncovered disturbing behavioral patterns from his childhood. He had chased his siblings with knives when he was younger, and at age 9, there were records of him being a victim of a sexual offense, though the details remain sealed due to his age at the time. His girlfriend Maddie revealed more warning signs. Once at the movies, while she was away getting popcorn, Gavin told their friend Rachel, "If someone came in here and pointed a gun at Maddie's head right now, I wouldn't do anything. I would just watch." These casual comments about violence, combined with his lack of emotional attachment, painted a picture of someone who had long struggled with basic human empathy. The application to work at the funeral home took on new significance in light of these revelations. It wasn't just a job application. It was part of a pattern of fascination with death and corpses that would ultimately lead to his horrific acts with Margaret's body. Experts who reviewed the case noted that Gavin's behaviors aligned with classic warning signs of developing psychopathy. Early cruelty to others, lack of empathy, thrill-seeking behavior, and the ability to maintain a normal facade while harboring violent fantasies. His journal entries showed he understood his actions were wrong but felt no moral restraint against committing them. What made the case particularly disturbing was how these dark impulses had coexisted with normal teenage life. The same phone that contained evidence of his crimes also held ordinary text messages with friends, homework assignments, and typical teenage social media posts. It was as if two Gavins existed, the ordinary teenager who worked at a pizza shop, and the predator who stalked the neighborhood at night, looking for opportunities to feed his darkest urges. This duality would later become central to the debate over his eventual sentence. Was he a troubled teen who could be rehabilitated, or had he revealed himself to be, as the judge would later describe, irreparably corrupt? The Wadsworth County Courthouse had seen many trials over the years, but none quite like this. In November 2018, as Gavin Ramsey faced the judge, the gravity of his crimes hung heavy in the air. The 17-year-old who had committed one of the most horrific murders in the town's history would be tried as an adult, facing charges that read like a nightmare. Aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, kidnapping, and gross abuse of a corpse. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had Gavin's confession, DNA evidence, and the disturbing contents of his phone. But it was the additional evidence that painted the full picture of horror. The blackberry jam used as lubricant, the 2 hours spent with Margaret's body, the videos and photos he had carefully documented, storing them in a folder password protected with the word murder. Gavin's defense team, facing insurmountable evidence, built their strategy around two key elements: his age and his medication. They argued that Zoloft, prescribed just months before the murder, had increased his aggressive tendencies. His mother became their star witness, tearfully telling the court, "If I could change one thing, I would never have agreed to put my son on Zoloft." Before this, his mother testified, "Gavin was loyal to a fault, he's compassionate. And this thing we're sitting here discussing is not who my son is." Her words rang hollow against the evidence, particularly when prosecutors pointed out that Gavin's journal entries about wanting to kill someone predated his Zoloft prescription. The defense also brought up Gavin's own trauma. Records showed he had been a victim of a sexual offense in 2009 at age 9. While the details remained sealed, they argued this early trauma had shaped his development. But prosecutors countered this argument effectively. Many people experience trauma, they noted, but they don't commit philia with 98-year-old victims. The most powerful moments came during the victim impact statements. Margaret's great-niece addressed the court. "Had he not been caught, I have no doubt that he would continue to escalate his crimes and continue killing. I believe he planned to kill numerous people. He used my aunt as a warm-up, so to speak." Her words proved prophetic, echoing the concerns investigators had expressed about Gavin's potential to become a serial killer. The prosecution's presentation of evidence was methodical and devastating. They showed how Gavin had stayed in Margaret's house from 2:09 a.m. to 4:10 a.m., leaving only because his mother would wake up at 5 a.m. They detailed how he had strangled her, taking several minutes to end her life, then proceeded to violate her body in ways that shocked even veteran courtroom observers. When Gavin finally addressed the court, his statement provided no real answers or closure. "I don't know how to explain why all this happened," he said, reading from a prepared statement. "I don't think there is an explanation to begin with. I think about it all the time. I take it back in a heartbeat if I could." His words seemed rehearsed, lacking the emotional depth one might expect from someone facing the consequences of such horrific actions. The judge's decision was unequivocal. Describing Gavin as irreparably corrupt, he handed down the maximum sentence: life without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for aggravated burglary, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse, all to be served consecutively. But the story didn't end there. A new Ohio Senate Bill, SP 256, would later abolish life imprisonment without parole for juvenile offenders, even those charged as adults. This meant that despite his life sentence, Gavin would have an automatic chance at parole after 25 years. The law sparked intense debate, with supporters arguing that juvenile brains aren't fully developed, while opponents pointed to cases like Gavin's as evidence that some crimes deserve permanent consequences. Margaret's family was devastated by this development. The relief they had felt at his life sentence evaporated with the realization that Gavin could potentially be free when he was just 42 years old. The amount of relief when we found out that he had life without parole was immeasurable. One family member said, "That relief is now gone because of Senate Bill 256. The family's fears weren't just about justice. They were about safety." We know that if we put our true thoughts in our impact statements, Gavin would read them, they explained. We discussed the risk of giving him fuel for the rage he carries inside him. Knowing that at some point he might be released while my siblings and I are still alive, the case raised difficult questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the balance between punishing horrific crimes and recognizing the special circumstances of juvenile offenders. As one prosecutor argued, maybe that's true for certain cases like drug-related offenses, but in these types of cases, someone who has a propensity to become a serial killer and then gets out in 25 or 30 years. I don't agree with that at all. As Gavin was led away to begin his sentence, the courthouse emptied, but the questions remained. Could someone capable of such calculated evil ever truly be rehabilitated? And if released, would society be safe? The answers would have to wait until at least 2043, when Gavin would face his first parole board, a date that Margaret's family now dreaded.